Hello, I'm Iskandar Razak. Also tonight, former Pacific leaders say climate change presents a greater threat to the region than China's growing influence. Meanwhile, the Solomon Islands Prime Minister has delivered a withering verbal assault on Australia while addressing the Parliament in Honiara. He mocked the federal government's complaints about his country's security deal with China. Scott Morrison has dismissed the criticism, but the extraordinary remarks highlight the worsening relationship between Honiara and Canberra. Here's Foreign Affairs reporter Stephen Jejets.
A furious Prime Minister lashes out.
What is needed, Mr. Speaker, is an acknowledgement of a serious blunder.
Australia's accused China and Solomon Islands of negotiating their security pact in secret. Now Manasseh Sogavare has hit back, finding a new target.
Today we join our nations in a next-generation partnership.
Taking aim at the nuclear submarine pact negotiated in secret by Australia and accusing Canberra of hypocrisy.
I learnt of the AUKUS Treaty in the media, Mr. Speaker. One would expect that as a member of the Pacific family, Solomon Islands or members of the Pacific should have been consulted.
Concern about the China pact isn't subsiding in the West.
I was concerned with the report about the Solomon Islands entering into a military agreement with China. That is alarming.
Now Australian attitudes are hardening, and today Mr Morrison was blunt when asked if Mr Sogavare was echoing Chinese talking points.
Well, there's a remarkable similarity between those statements and those of the Chinese government.
The Defence Pact isn't the only agreement that Canberra is watching closely. The ABC has obtained an MOU signed in 2019 by Solomon Islands and a subsidiary of AVIC, the Chinese state-owned defence and aerospace giant. In the agreement, AVIC promises to upgrade 35 airfields in Solomon Islands if the Pacific Island country purchases 6 of its commercial aircraft. The agreement went nowhere, but it's another sign of China's strategic intent in Solomon Islands. Stephen Jejets, ABC News, Canberra.
Ukraine's capital has been rocked by a Russian missile strike during a high-level visit by the chief of the United Nations. Nobody was killed in the blasts, but the attack has been condemned by Ukrainian officials as an act of Russian brutality and an attempt to humiliate the UN.
Another Russian attack, but also, perhaps, a message. The first missile strike to hit Kyiv in 2 weeks came as the UN Secretary-General toured the capital.
Look at that.
Just 2 days ago, Antonio Guterres met with the Russian president in Moscow. Now he's seen for himself the death and destruction which Vladimir Putin's so-called special military operation has wrought upon Ukraine's people.
I imagine my family in one of those houses.
Russia's already been suspended from the UN human rights body for its indiscriminate attacks here, which have killed and displaced thousands of civilians. But Ukraine says the timing of Russia's latest attack in Kyiv conveys a complete disregard for the UN and for international law.
This says a lot about Russia's true attitude towards global institutions, about attempts by Russian authorities to humiliate the UN and everything that the organization represents.
During his visit, Mr Guterres expressed regret for the world's inability to stop the violence.
The Security Council failed to do everything in its power to prevent and end this war.
The bill is passed.
Holding the stick, the US has agreed to resurrect a World War II program
under the Lend-Lease Act of March 1941,
which helped supply planes, tanks and weapons to allies to help defeat Hitler's Nazi forces.
This is about freedom versus dictatorship.
Born in World War II, a strategy now that will set the foundation for victory in this war.
US President Joe Biden is also seeking more than $46 billion to support Ukraine, a dramatic increase in American funding.
The cost of this fight is not cheap, but caving to aggression is going to be more costly if we allow it to happen.
He's hoping that if Ukraine gets the tools it needs to keep fighting, it could liberate itself from the tyranny of this war. Nick Dole, ABC News.
At least 12 Palestinians have been injured in Jerusalem's Al-Aqsa Mosque complex during another round of early morning clashes with Israeli police. Security forces have fired tear gas and rubber bullets to disperse the demonstrators. They say they moved in after Palestinians began hurling stones and fireworks, some of them towards the western wall below Al-Aqsa where Jews gather to pray. Police are braced for disturbances as thousands of worshippers are expected to gather later for Friday prayers. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi has warned that temperatures across the country are rising more rapidly and earlier than expected. Millions of Indians are in the middle of a brutal heat wave, with the temperature in the capital expected to top 44 degrees Celsius this week. The heat has triggered an increase in power demand, leading to outages in many states and fears of a coal shortage. The extreme temperatures follow India's hottest March since records began more than 120 years ago. Back home, and the ACT Supreme Court has dismissed an application from the man accused of raping Brittany Higgins inside Parliament House for a permanent stay on charges against him. Bruce Lerman was charged last year after Ms Higgins complained to police. Prosecutors had been gearing up for a trial in June, but Mr Lerman's lawyers told the ACT Supreme Court he wouldn't get a fair trial because it would be impossible to find an impartial jury given the publicity. But today, the ACT's Chief Justice, Lucy McCallum, dismissed his application, clearing the way for a trial. Power prices are another cost of living pressures being debated this election, with the cost of electricity soaring in recent months. Let's return to the campaign trail, and that issue has been front of mind for Labor leader Anthony Albanese after he came back from COVID isolation, and he's been spruiking his party's plan for more transmission infrastructure, while the coalition is focused on hydrogen power. Here's political reporter Melissa Clark.
Out of COVID ISO and back on the campaign trail.
I certainly feel much better today than I did yesterday.
The hip pocket remains the focus on the hustings.
We know that the cost of everything is going up, but people's wages just aren't.
The external influences on the economy are going to continue.
Electricity is among the household bills getting bigger. Wholesale power prices have risen 67% in 3 months and 141% compared to the same time last year. The price hikes are greatest in Queensland and New South Wales because of surging international demand for black coal, damage to the Callide B coal-fired power station, and constraints in the electricity grid. It's those constraints in transmission that Labor is focused on, promising $20 billion of upgrades to the grid to help integrate more renewables.
If we get this right, if we fix the grid, we will see those energy prices drop by $275 by 2025.
Yeah, OK.
The coalition argues many of those upgrades are unnecessary, and what's needed is more firming power to back up renewables.
That's why we have invested in Snowy 2.0. That's why we're doing Battery of the Nation. That's why we've invested in gas-fired power in Kurri Kurri.
For industry, hydrogen has the potential to be a clean power source. The coalition is funding 8 hydrogen hubs around the country, each one a new campaign opportunity.
What we're aiming to build here is a globally competitive clean hydrogen industry.
The focus on cost of living pressures will only get more intense from here. The Reserve Bank is meeting on Tuesday, and there are high expectations it will lift the official cash rate for the first time in more than a decade, putting extra pressure on household budgets and on politicians seeking the mantle of superior economic management. Halfway through the campaign, but still weeks from the finish line, there are plenty more stunts and site visits to come.
Whoa! It's going to be a good day.
Some stiff drinks may be required. Melissa Clark, ABC News, Canberra.
Let's get some analysis now on the current situation in Ukraine, and we're joined by Global Affairs Analyst and founder of EA Worldview, Scott Lucas. Scott Lucas, thank you for your time. Let's talk about these missile strikes that have hit the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv. How brazen were they?
Oh, how far do you want to go on the scale of brazen? Russia has done this before. Alongside the Assad regime in Syria, while there was a UN peacekeeping mission in that country during its conflict, they kept attacking while the mission was trying to operate, eventually confining that mission to its hotel in Damascus. But this time it was the head of the UN, the Secretary General, who was meeting President Zelensky, a high-profile talk about the humanitarian situation, about the military situation, and Russia then lobs 5 cruise missiles into Kyiv within hours of their joint press conference. Now, there were specific targets that were hit. There was a factory that makes anti-aircraft missiles that was hit. But of course, they also hit this residential building, this high-rise, setting it on fire, which really shows that the Russians, they don't care if civilians are affected, and they don't care if the UN's trying to intervene, because remember, the day before Guterres met Zelensky, he met Vladimir Putin in Moscow, where Putin repeatedly lied about Russian military operations.
No one was killed in these impacts, as far as we can tell, so far in Kyiv. But the political impact and repercussions, what do you make of it?
Well, just an update. We now are hearing that there are 2 civilian fatalities. There's one in the residential building, according to Vladimir Klitschko, the mayor of Kiev, and there was a Ukrainian journalist who worked for Radio Liberty who was killed near the anti-aircraft factory. But in terms of the wider question, which is Russia will continue as it struggles on the ground with its offensives to try to disrupt the ability for Ukraine to move its own forces. That's why it hits railway stations. That's why it hits these production factories that make military equipment. At the same time, however, Russia is trying to do 2 other things. They're trying to intimidate the international community, don't provide military aid, don't provide economic aid to Kyiv, and perhaps most importantly, they're trying to terrorize the civilians in Ukraine, trying to break their will to support the resistance.
Let's talk about Antonio Guterres. He's been vocal. He's met with Vladimir Putin and now Volodymyr Zelensky, but he's also criticised the UN Security Council for failing in this regard. Why did he do that, and will that have any longer-term impact?
Well, I mean, it's a statement of fact. The fact is that the Security Council did not do anything to be able to check this invasion by Vladimir Putin, and that the UN has largely been sidelined with the pretense by Russia that it's negotiating when it has no intention to do so. But there's an implicit message by what Guterres said. The Supreme Security Council is paralyzed because of a Russian veto. The Russians weren't going to allow the Security Council to do anything, which points to a longer-term issue for the UN. How can it operate if one of its permanent members on the Security Council is the aggressor in a conflict? But I think there's a wider message beyond this, which is, all right, if we cannot operate to keep the Russians from invading, how can we highlight the humanitarian issue? And not only how can we highlight the humanitarian issue, if Russia continues to attack, can we highlight the killing of civilians? Because the UN will be involved with other agencies in investigating the war crimes by Russian troops during and after this conflict.
Do you have any information about any new operations to evacuate civilians, particularly in the east and south? Do we know what's happening on the ground now?
Well, on the specific with Mariupol, which I'm sure your viewers have been following for more than 2 months as it's besieged, we still have up to 1,000 civilians in the steelworks where the Ukrainian defenders are set up. And the Russians will put out their propaganda, oh, the civilians can leave, they can leave. Putin told Guterres that earlier this week. They can't leave. It's effectively a surrender or die situation, and there's no way to get to those people. You cannot break the Russian hold on the area. In the east, the hope is to evacuate as many residents as possible because of the Russian ground offensive, but the Russians have been blocking the evacuations either by shelling in the areas they control or by attacking railway stations in the Ukrainian-controlled areas, including a couple weeks ago where they killed at least 57 people in one assault.
We've spoken a little bit about Vladimir Putin and Russia being on the UN Security Council. The other key member, although they're all key members, but the US, and the US isn't budging either from its support of Ukraine. President Joe Biden providing $33 billion for support. What do you make of that? Is that enough in any way?
Look, the fact is, how much is enough when Russia is committed to this assault? But what we can say is that the international aid, not just the US, not just UK or Europe, countries like Australia, has helped Ukraine push Russia out of northern Ukraine. Now we're in the phase of the assault on the east and the south of the country. And what we're seeing from the international community, not only with military aid, economic aid, and humanitarian aid, is they're going to keep escalating. Germany, for the first time, considering sending heavy armor to Ukraine. Japan, sending medicine and humanitarian supplies. Australia, sending armored vehicles as well. In other words, this is not just a U.S. versus Russia fight, as Moscow wants to portray it. The international community has said Ukraine has prevented itself from falling in the opening weeks of this war. Now we're ready for the long haul.
Scott Lucas, thank you so much for your time, your analysis and your insights.
Thank you, Isk.
Meantime, hundreds of thousands of Russians have chosen to leave the country because of the impact of the war on their work and lifestyles. But Western nations, including Australia, have restricted access to Russian travellers. So instead, many are flocking to South Asia, which is welcoming them with open arms. Correspondent Avani Dias reports from Sri Lanka.
Sri Lanka has long been a holiday hotspot for Russian travellers, but now they're not going home.
A lot of people, young people, strong and creative, they are moving from Russia. They don't want to live in this country anymore.
As war raged in Ukraine, Polina and her partner Dmitry frantically searched for flights out of Moscow. She says her career in film had no future in a sanctioned Russia.
We realized that we need to move somewhere.
The couple are part of the more than 300,000 Russians who fled to a handful of countries where they're still welcome. They're tech workers, creative freelancers and managers who can work remotely.
I'm not going to come back to Russia because I don't want to mess with the war.
Russians say life in Sri Lanka is now better than at home, despite daily power cuts because of an economic crisis. But they can't escape the impacts of sanctions. Their bank cards don't work because MasterCard and Visa have blocked Russians from withdrawing money in protest of the war.
I don't have my Apple Music anymore. I don't have my Google documents anymore. I don't have my email anymore.
Others, like Oleg Yakovlev, say they face persecution in Vladimir Putin's Russia during the war. He's an activist and a member of the LGBTQI community, and the only flight out was to Sri Lanka.
It's very dangerous to stay in Russia because all my life, for 20 years, I was in opposite to Russian political regime. And this is why I decided to move away as fast as I can.
There are many Russian travellers here on the south coast of Sri Lanka, and it's representative of South Asian countries' relationships with the Kremlin. Nations like India, Sri Lanka and Pakistan have refused to condemn or blacklist Russia over its invasion of Ukraine. And experts say that reduces the impact of sanctions from Western countries. As tensions simmer between the West and the Kremlin, this paradise remains a Russian refuge for now. Avani Dias, ABC News, Marissa.
Closer to home, and a group of former Pacific Island leaders saying inaction on climate change is a more pressing security threat to the region than China's growing influence. Among them is Hilda Heine, the former president of the Marshall Islands. She says Pacific people feel their concerns are not being addressed.
Over the years, Pacific leaders have put out declarations after declarations, urging that actions be taken on climate security, because that is our primary concern. And we don't see the urgency that is being taken by our development partners, including Australia. I think it's important for our partners to acknowledge that Pacific nations are sovereign, and that it's important for them to consult, to sit down and talk with Pacific people about their futures. We think that more should be done in terms of consultations. We see all the declarations coming out. For example, the Indo-Pacific strategy. I don't think that there is been enough consultations with Pacific leaders and Pacific people. In fact, we've talk about the issue of bundling Pacific with India or the Indo-Pacific region or Asia. We're lost in that process. We're small countries, and when we're bundled up with all the Asian countries, I wonder how much of our issues would be prominent in the discussions. Australia needs to start by cutting its emission level and making sure that its target leads to 1.5 degrees Celsius as is set out in the Paris Agreement. Right now, Australia's target will increase temperature up to 4 degrees centigrade, or Celsius, not centigrade, I'm sorry, Celsius. And that means countries like the Marshall Islands, Tuvalu, Kiribati will be submerged. That's the future that we're seeing with the current trajectory that is there in terms of Australia's policies.
And we'll have more on the Pacific's demands for climate action with our reporter Talio Latia later in the program. Meanwhile, 2 explosions have killed at least 9 people and wounded 13 in northern Afghanistan. The blasts, which happened within minutes of each other, targeted families in Mazar-e-Sharif who were travelling home to break their Ramadan fast. Kate Clark is the co-director of the Afghanistan Analyst Network, and she says the attack has all the hallmarks of those carried out by the Islamic State group.
Well, there's been a number of attacks, and they're clearly on Shia Muslim Afghans. Typically also from the ethnic Hazara group, who are largely Shia, not entirely, but they're associated with Shia Islam. They have all the hallmarks of Islamic State terrorism. So, the sectarian aspect, but also hitting schools, hitting mosques, so hitting places that are absolutely civilian, quite clearly civilian, and also targeting schools is also a hallmark of Islamic State, and it looks like they're trying to hit the younger generation, and also that they pride themselves on having none of the boundaries that that other armed groups in Afghanistan have had. There are certain categories of people that should be off limits, women, children in particular, that are clearly not off target. So there's been a pace of the attacks that has just been deeply, deeply distressing. And the authorities now, as before, so now that the Taliban are in charge, and before when the government of Ashraf Ghani and Hamid Karzai were in charge, they don't seem either able or willing to protect these areas.
Kate Clark, has Islamic State claimed official responsibility, and what is the security situation throughout the country?
Well, the security situation's mixed. There isn't an active war as there was before the Taliban claimed power. So from that sense, it is safer generally now. There's no, there aren't front lines. There aren't air raids. There aren't airstrikes. The Taliban themselves are not carrying out suicide bombings or mass casualty attacks in cities. And there aren't assassinations by the Taliban as they were carrying out previously. However, that having been said, the Islamic State is still a problem. There have been cross-border attacks by Pakistan recently. The Taliban itself, despite declaring an amnesty for all those who were involved in the previous government and the security forces, there are continuing reports of disappearances, forced disappearances, detentions, torture, particularly of security forces, but also activists, including women activists. Journalists are being detained and often beaten up. And then you have these these bombs. We also hear occasionally of assassinations elsewhere of the Taliban and the groups who want to start an armed resistance against the Taliban. They're also mustering attacks. So, I mean, in general, you'd have to say the number of people being killed and injured in Afghanistan because of violence is way down than it was this time a year ago, but it has not gone away. And in many ways, the conflict is frozen. Afghanistan, you cannot say it's at peace yet.
So who has control right now? Do the Taliban, I mean, there's obviously a lot going on, but do the Taliban have control of the country in any shape or form in a governmental sense?
Yes, they do. The Taliban are in control of Afghanistan. And if you look at most of the other periods in this long, long war that started in 1978 with a communist coup and then the Soviet invasion, this is, as in 2001 when the US had its military intervention in Afghanistan and there was a new government then, these are probably the only two periods when you have actually had a unitary governing authority. So in 2001, of course, that lasted for a few years and then crumbled in the face of a Taliban insurgency. At the moment, the armed opposition, the sort of pro-republic armed opposition, as well as Islamic State, and they're very, very different beasts, they're taking pinpricks out of the Taliban. And actually, you'd think that the Taliban, which is it's a group that's always been fighting since its foundation in the early 90s, is clearly more comfortable fighting than governing. I would anticipate that they would actually prefer armed rebellion, as they would see it, to mass civilian disobedience. And the unhappiness with the Taliban amongst the population is there. It's not universal. There's many people who welcome the Taliban, but many others see them as an occupying force.
Well, we're still talking about the security situation there. Seeing that there's a former general in what was the Afghan army saying he and many other former soldiers and politicians are preparing to launch a new war against the Taliban. What would that look like, and could it even be successful?
Well, I mean, there's two things. One, there is clearly unhappiness with the Taliban government. This is a conflict where the drivers of conflict have not gone away. The Taliban have taken monopolistic control of the country. They don't have anyone else in their government, and Afghanistan is a rich, varied nation. The Taliban are all male, they're all mullahs, they're mainly from one ethnic group. They don't reflect Afghanistan, and they've taken a very authoritarian, actually quite violent approach to governing, including pushing through very unwelcome rules like banning older girls' education. But what happens to that discontent? Now, in the past, eventually that's become armed resistance, and that might happen now. It could turn into civic disobedience, which looks more unlikely. At the moment, Afghans that are really unhappy, they're looking for a way out. They're looking to escape the country. You'd expect them to become refugees rather than work out ways to either fight or to organise politically. So there are people, including members of the former security services like General Sami Sadat, who are looking to open up the fight again. As I said, I think the Taliban will probably be happier with armed resistance that they know how to deal with than mass protests, mass demonstrations, which they're much more wary about. They're much less comfortable in dealing with.
Kate Clark, it's an increasingly saddening, infuriating, maddening situation to watch from afar. Worse if you're there, but thank you so much for your time. The Queen has been pictured without her walking stick in newly released photographs. The 96-year-old monarch held an in-person audience with Switzerland's president as she returned to work at Windsor Castle. She's been suffering from mobility issues in recent months, forcing her to cancel or miss several high-profile events. 4 astronauts have arrived at the International Space Station. The crew included the first black woman to ever join the ISS and the first European woman to command the station. The SpaceX Dragon capsule took off from Florida before a fully automated docking procedure locked them into the space station. You're watching The World. The top stories we're following tonight. The Prime Minister of Solomon Islands has accused Australia of hypocrisy by criticising the secrecy of his country's military pact with China. Russia confirms it launched multiple missile strikes on Ukraine in the past day, including those which struck the capital Kyiv, where the UN Secretary-General was visiting. At least one person has been killed in the attack. And Indian authorities are warning that around large parts of the country may be facing a prolonged heat wave as it swelters in temperatures of up to 45 degrees. China's capital, Beijing, is closing all city schools in a further tightening of COVID restrictions. Authorities announced 50 new cases in the city on Thursday, bringing total infections in the latest wave to around 150. Students make up more than 30% of the cases, with clusters linked to 6 schools and 2 kindergartens. Beijing has moved quickly to avoid a total shutdown of the city like that seen in Shanghai recently. A Ukrainian artist who fled the war in his homeland last month has taken to painting his new surrounds in southwest Victoria in an effort to raise funds for the war effort. And he's doing it all with donated art supplies from Warrnambool residents who are doing whatever they can to help those suffering half a world away. Daniel Miles has the details.
With every scrape of paint, Volodymyr Normankov pours his heart onto the canvas. The fine strokes belie the trauma he and his wife Valentina faced when they fled Ukraine amid bombing and gunfire.
Our suburb was under heavy shelling. We just slept in the basement of our house. It was pretty scary.
The pair arrived at their daughter Olena's Warrnambool home after a torrid 22-day trip with little more than the clothes on their backs.
We were very surprised by the silence because during the last few days we felt very tense, always expecting explosions.
A simple call-out for unused art supplies saw the couple inundated. Normankov's among 7 displaced Ukrainians seeking refuge in the town that's doing whatever it can to support the beleaguered country. Piece by piece, stroke by stroke, a sense of normalcy returned for Volodymyr.
We are very touched by the attention of Warrnambool's community. We're lucky to live here and lucky to be here.
Winslow wool producers Brendan and Susan Finnegan's best fleece can be found in some of Italy's biggest fashion houses. This year, they're donating the best cut and sending the money made to the war effort.
This isn't going to make a huge difference, but they need so much help. But if everyone's doing it, it's when, lots of little people doing things makes a huge difference.
Volodymyr's art set to go under the hammer at a charity auction in Warrnambool this weekend as part of a series of fundraising events run by the community, with all proceeds going straight to Ukraine. But no matter how much is raised, to those far from home, there's always a need for more.
Even this, it's not enough. It's like a drop in the ocean, but it makes me feel better to do something useful.
A healing stroke of paint for a heartbroken nation. Daniel Miles, ABC News, Warrnambool.
Returning to tensions in the Pacific now, and a high-profile group of Pacific leaders is warning that the Solomon Islands security pact with China is overshadowing the region's biggest threat, climate change. The group, Pacific Elders' Voice, says Pacific Island countries should primarily determine the region's security and future. Reporter Talia Olatia joins me now. Talia, thanks for your time. Who is this group, the Pacific Elders' Voice?
Well, the group are just that, Pacific Elders, who are voicing their opinions. Their members include former Pacific leaders. So we're talking Hilda Heine, the former president of the Marshall Islands, Tommy Remengesau Jr., the former president of Palau, Anate Tong, the former president of Kiribati, and Anele Sopoaga, the former president of Tuvalu, as well as Dame Meg Taylor, who is the former Secretary-General of the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat. So they are an independent alliance who are seeking to offer advice and guidance in order to strengthen Pacific resilience. And they do that by addressing issues that are facing the Pacific now, but also into the future. And they're a really important and obviously well-respected group given their pedigree, but particularly given the challenges of the Pacific Island Forum with the Micronesian bloc seeking to leave that group. They really do provide a united Pacific voice that advocates for Pacific peoples on Pacific issues.
Well, the big issue for Australia has been the security deal between Solomon Islands and China, fears that this will lead to a Chinese military presence in the Pacific. The US is concerned about that. But what does this group say is the real issue here that we need to be worried about?
Look, this group hasn't reinvented the wheel. Essentially, what they have come out to say today is the same thing that they have been saying for years, that the biggest security threat that faces Pacific nations is climate change, and that insecurities caused by climate change, we're talking rising sea levels, we're talking about catastrophic cyclones, are being felt by Pacific peoples right now, and that is a more pressing issue than, you know, military tensions and geostrategic tensions as well. So they are really calling on international parties to listen to their concerns when it does come to climate change. They also said, and as you heard from Prime Minister of Solomon Islands, Manasseh Sogavare, that there is an anger and a frustration that Pacific nations, Pacific leaders are not being listened to when it comes to their own sovereignty, and also when it comes to, you know, strategic policies that are going to affect the region. So when we talk about the Pacific, obviously it's huge, it's vast. When we talk about the land, sea and exclusive economic zone, it makes up an area that is bigger than Russia, US and China combined. And so you can understand why a lot of countries, Australia, Japan, the US, have strategic interests that work into the Pacific. The problem is that they're trying to gain their influence without consulting Pacific countries. And that's what I meant with Sogavare, saying how angry he was that he heard about the AUKUS deal by reading it in the media rather than being consulted by, you know, the people who are involved as a Pacific leader. And I think that that's why the Pacific Elders' Voice have so much voice in this particular conversation, because as former Pacific leaders, they would know that the consultation probably hasn't been happening in the past. And so that's why they're saying now that, you know, Pacific countries, they have their own sovereign rights, they need to be listened to, and they need to be involved primarily as the ones who develop, you know, strategic policies that are going to affect their land and their people right now.
Talia, has that issue been forgotten in the global conversation right now?
I don't know if it's been forgotten as much as it has been pushed aside, because, you know, these leaders in the Pacific Elders Voice group are some of the front global leaders when it comes to climate change and demanding climate action and ambitious climate targets. You only have to look back to 2019 at the Pacific Islands Forum in Tuvalu, where I think a lot of people will remember the comments made by Anele Sopoaga, the former president of Tuvalu, who was asked to kind of sum up his interactions with Scott Morrison at that conference. And it, of course, came after Scott Morrison picked up that coal in the Parliament and said, don't be worried about that, where he said that the conversations that he was essentially having with the Australian Prime Minister was that, you know, you're focused on the economy and saving that, and I'm focused on saving the people here in Tuvalu. And that is, I think, a really important case when it comes to climate change, because unlike, you know, foreign aid, foreign development, where, you know, international influencers can just throw some money at the problem, climate policy relies on domestic policy. It's up to countries like Australia to make really ambitious targets. And so obviously the Pacific countries hold other countries accountable. We know that China is the largest consumer of coal. They have pledged, you know, by 2060 that they will have net zero emissions. Australia is saying that they'll achieve that by 2050. But, you know, when we're talking about 30, 40 years from now, these are issues that Pacific countries are dealing with right now. And there has been a lot of pressure on the Australian government to pretty much say, hey, do you reckon why a lot of these countries might be moving to China or losing stead, or, you know, Canberra's losing stead in the Pacific, is because you're not listening to them on climate change. So I think the Pacific Elders Voice, the statement they released today, is kind of just echoing what they've always been saying, in the hopes that, I guess, the tides are turning and maybe people will actually start listening as, you know, Pacific issues become more on the forefront in the Australian collective communications.
Talia Althea, thank you so much for breaking it down for us. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Now, this year is the 80th anniversary of the World War II campaign on Papua New Guinea's Kokoda track, and Australians, however, could be blocked from making the popular pilgrimage. Villagers have been erecting barriers along the walk, demanding overdue payments from the government, while operators have complained of poor management along the track. Charlie Lynn owns the tour company Adventure Kokoda.
The issue is the there's a proposed Kokoda Track Management Authority bill that's been proposed by the Australian government, and it actually disenfranchises the traditional resource custodians from representation on the new board. That is the main issue. The other issue that is causing a lot of angst over there is the number of illegal trek operators that are currently operating on the trail and allowed to operate. They're being given licences by the management authority without any due diligence. So they're missing out on a lot of benefits. And it's been escalating for some time because since 2009, when the Australian government took over responsibility for the management of the trail, trekker numbers have actually fallen by 46%. And this has resulted in a cumulative loss of $19 million in foregone wages and campsite fees and village purchases. So we've spent about $50 to $60 million trying to help them, and they're almost $20 million worse off.
That's Kokoda Track Adventure Company owner Charlie Lin. In other news, the UN's nuclear watchdog says Japan is making significant progress on its plans to release treated radioactive wastewater from the wrecked Fukushima nuclear plant next year. The water is being stored in about 1,000 tanks on site, which must be removed so facilities can be built for its decommissioning. Japan has sought the International Atomic Energy Agency's help to ensure the release meets international safety standards. It's also seeking to reassure neighbouring countries who have criticised the plans. Anthony Albanese has touched down in Perth ahead of Labor's official campaign launch that he'll use to restart his bid for election after a week in isolation. Labor's taken a highly unconventional approach by picking Perth for the big event, but it shows the party sees an opportunity to end the Liberals' decades-long federal dominance in the West. Political reporter Jane Norman filed this report from Perth.
Fortunes of the mining boom lured Taylor Moore to the West, setting him up with the savings to set up his own cafe that's been largely unaffected by the pandemic.
Life over here has been really normal, and so it's been hard to sort of relate with anything else that's going on around Australia or around the world.
Life is a little less normal now. Omicron's arrived, and in Perth's outer suburbs, there's only one thing on voters' minds.
COVID. When's COVID going to end?
Just like Taylor Moore, Labor's hoping WA delivers, targeting Swan and Pearce, held by retiring Liberal MPs, as well as Hasluck. Winning all three would be a big ask. Labor failed to gain a single seat here in 2019. What's different this time around?
I think it is that the electorate knows Scott Morrison and they don't like him.
The Prime Minister's brand was battered by his decision to back Clive Palmer's bid to tear down the state's hard border. So bruised by it, at this election, the Liberals aren't directing any preferences to Palmer's party in WA.
He's the one who challenged Western Australia's border controls that saved countless lives and saved our economy.
Federally, WA has long been a Liberal stronghold. 10 of the 15 seats are blue. But at a state level, the party was decimated at last year's election in a Labor landslide led by a wildly popular Premier.
West Australians aren't mugs. They know who runs defence and the economy, and they know that that's the Morrison government.
WA is the largest state, the powerhouse of the nation's economy, but with just 15 of 151 seats, it rarely decides who wins the federal election. In fact, the result is often known by the time the sun sets over here on polling night. So for Labor to launch its campaign in Perth for the first time in more than 80 years, it shows the party spies rare opportunity in the resource state. Jane Norman, ABC News, Perth.
Across Australia, the rising cost of living is pushing some families to the edge. After the rent and bills are paid, experts say increasingly it's food that people are going without, and many of them are turning to charities to provide it. Ahmed Yusuf reports.
Annette Formosa never thought she'd be relying on others to put food on the table. Now, though, she can't see any other way.
We'll starve. There'll be no food.
The Western Sydney mother hasn't always needed the help of her local community.
It's so expensive. Like, before you can buy the 2-minute steaks, they used to be $5 a tray, 10. Now it's $10. And it's just like, sometimes when you've got $50 to do the week's shopping, that $10, you just can't do it.
Last year, 1 in 6 Australian adults struggled getting enough food to eat. And now inflation is the highest it's been in 2 decades. Community services in the outer suburbs have seen an increased demand for food hampers, which has now become an essential part of their service.
So many people, with all the rising costs of living, so many people just need that little bit of extra help to get through the weeks.
What fresh stuff are we giving out today?
Experts say when times get tough,
we got some cauliflower, potatoes,
and things like rent and petrol have to be paid for, food is the first to go. Thank you. In Melbourne's northwest, this community centre feeds 300 families a week.
We're certainly noticing people that are trying to get help, vouchers, food, where they haven't had to before.
Here's your bag, yeah.
Imad Abughut has been coming weekly for the last few months. It all went downhill when his car broke down and he lost his job. He's feeling the pinch, and it might even decide which political leader gets his vote.
If they help me, I'll help him. We are Australia. Yeah. If they don't help me for living, for food, why election for him?
They talk the talk, but they don't know what it's like not to be able to give your child something they want. Like spend a day how we live. They couldn't.
She hasn't heard anything yet that will decide her vote. Ahmed Yusuf, ABC News.
After nearly 16 years of service protecting Australia's shores, the Royal Australian Navy's patrol ship HMAS Maitland has been decommissioned to be replaced by the next generation of offshore patrol vessels. In a ceremony in Darwin, the crew farewelled the beloved ship as they looked towards the future. Nabir Khan went along.
She's protected Australia's borders for 16 years, but last night HMS Maitland's commander and crew marched off for a final time.
It is a bittersweet moment. It becomes your second home and protects you from the sea, and you do grow quite fond of it.
HMS Maitland, ho! The patrol boat has been based in Darwin since 2006, used by the Royal Australian Navy to intercept foreign fishing vessels, drug traffickers, and take part in international military operations.
I've been all over the place, from Cocos-Keeling Island to Brisbane to Whitsundays, PNG, Solomon Islands.
After more than a decade of service on the sea, HMS Maitland was decommissioned.
It was a really good ride. Looking forward to the next step in my career. But yeah, lots of good memories.
Families of sailors watched on to celebrate the ship and those who dedicated their lives to her. HMS Maitland is the second patrol boat of the Armidale class to be decommissioned, as the Navy looks to modernise, replacing them with the Arafura class. With the decommissioning of the old, the welcoming of the new, and Pacific tensions rising, the incoming class may face some busy years ahead.
The Arafura class are a bigger vessel and will have a larger endurance and be able to stay at sea longer and go further than the current Armidale class patrol boats.
A bittersweet farewell to a ship who served many. Nabir Khan, ABC News.
The United States Army has toasted an elderly Italian woman with a birthday cake 77 years after troops pinched one from her mother's windowsill during the Second World War. Soldiers were in Vicenza, northwest of Venice, to mark the day the 88th Infantry Division fought its way into the city in 1945. Back then, Mary Mill spent the night of her 13th birthday sheltering in the attic of her home from retreating German soldiers. But when she woke up, her cake was nowhere to be found. Australian cricket selectors have named 3 near full-strength sides to tour Sri Lanka in June. Western Australia's Mitch Marsh has been named in all 3 squads as he looks to play his first Test match since 2019. Australian head selector George Bailey has backed the white ball captain Aaron Finch to return to form after some recent poor scores.
I don't think you've forged a reputation and the record that he has over such a long period of time to know that there's a hell of a lot of talent, there's a hell of a lot of skill, and as I said, he's a really important player in that team. let alone the captaincy.
The Australians will play 2 Test matches, 5 one-dayers and 3 T20 internationals during the tour. Melbourne United will travel to Tasmania holding a 1-0 lead in their 3-game playoff in the NBL playoff series after claiming a 74 to 63 point win in Game 1 last night. United made light work of the Jack Jumpers, who made their playoff debut at John Cain Arena, despite the final margin being just 11 points. The reigning champions were in control of what was at times a very physical affair.
It's the Detroit Pistons versus Chicago Bulls, kind of old school basketball, just smash mouth, bang up kind of game. And yeah, we had a good fight.
I was a Pistons fan back in the day, so we're certainly not the bad boys, but we get after it defensively.
Matthew Dellavedova bizarrely airballed 2 free throws late in the game, but he'll shake off an arm injury and take to the court for Game 2 in Hobart tomorrow night. To the NRL, and the Rabbitohs have defeated Manly 40 points to 22 in tonight's clash at Central Coast Stadium. Earlier, the Panthers beat the Titans 18 points to 4 on the Gold Coast. Meanwhile, the NRL Grand Final looks set to stay in Sydney. After repeated threats by the league to take its showpiece event back to Queensland, it appears to have found common ground with the New South Wales Premier for now.
Sydney, Brisbane, even Melbourne. This morning, it was anyone's game.
The grand final is up for grabs.
By this afternoon, it was close to game over.
I think we're close to a deal.
The NRL boss and New South Wales Premier reaching an in-principle agreement to keep the grand final in Sydney.
We've got to put the ink to the paper first, and, you know, the devil's in the detail.
That detail is expected to include multi-million-dollar makeovers for suburban stadiums like the Sea Eagles Brookvale Oval and the Dragons' home ground in Cogra.
No, it's not bribery, because we had a deal, and the deal was that they would spend $800 million on stadiums.
In 2020, the state government scrapped an $800 million plan to redevelop the Olympic Stadium. That money was tied to a deal that secured grand finals in New South Wales until 2046. While the deal to redevelop the stadium here at Sydney Olympic Park may be long gone, today's agreement paves the way for it to host NRL grand finals for the next 2 decades. Some critics have questioned whether the state government should be spending more money on sporting venues following big spends on stadiums in Parramatta and Moore Park, with funds already put aside for another one in Penrith. But Panthers fans aren't complaining.
Well, Queensland wants everything, don't they? Hey? They want everything that we've got down here. They want our players.
Makes more sense to have it in Sydney.
The grand final's not going anywhere.
Well, not unless the pandemic forces another last-minute shift north of the Tweed. Phoebe Bowden, ABC News, Sydney.
Time for a check of the weather now. Here's Paul Higgins.
A band of rain will move across the nation's southeast tonight and tomorrow. In New South Wales, most of that rain will fall west of the divide. Elsewhere, cooler southwesterly winds will be pushing across the south after a cold front, and onshore winds will bring a few showers to Queensland's southeast and north tropical coast, and there'll be a shower or two for the Pilbara. Closer in, the chance of showers in the southwest, the southern interior and eastern Queensland, but especially over the north tropical coast. Mostly sunny elsewhere, a shower or two for Brisbane. Rain or showers with thunderstorms over most of New South Wales. They'll contract to the northeast in the afternoon. Heavy falls are possible inland. Morning fog in the east. In Canberra, 10 to 15 millimetres of morning rain, and up to 10 in Sydney from late in the morning. The rain and thunderstorms now over Victoria will clear east early in the morning, then a partly cloudy day coming up. Overnight rain, then dry tomorrow in Melbourne. In Tasmania, showers will contract to the west in the afternoon. A gusty west to northwest wind, the chance of a morning shower in Hobart. In South Australia, a few showers in the northeast and about southern coastal districts, clearing during the afternoon, partly cloudy and 19 degrees in Adelaide. Most of the west will be dry, apart from light showers over the southwest coast and the central and western Pilbara. It'll be sunny in Perth, and over the territory we have a few showers and thunderstorms expected in most districts and in Darwin during the afternoon.
Thanks, Paul. Before we go, let's recap our top stories. The Prime Minister of Solomon Islands has accused Australia of hypocrisy for criticising his country's military pact with China. And Russia confirms it launched missile strikes on Kyiv in the past day, killing at least one person. And that's your world for tonight. You can always watch the show on iView, and more world news and interviews can be found at the ABC's YouTube channel. I'm Iskandar Razak. Bye for now.
Well, 90 years doesn't seem a long time to me. I feel exactly the same as I did when I was very young, except looking in the mirror is a bit of a shock.
I've had a love affair with horses since the day I was born.
A horse is an amazing animal. You have a connection of the minds.
It's good, isn't it?
RDA is Riding for Disabled Association. It's been a treasured part of my life. I've just met extraordinary people all my life. Horses are incredible because they seem to know with people's disabilities. You get back from the children much more than you ever give. Oh, it's wonderful. People with disabilities have achieved so much, so much. I'm Aileen and I'm 90 years young.
Their mates living the dream. Until things get personal.
I'm so better than you, old man. You're amazing.
But friendship has a breaking point.
You and Snap were headed for a fall a long time ago.
If I hadn't got that money, you'd still be sewing wetsuits.
I was only a way to fix the mess you put us in. Go on, mate. Show them who you really are. When did all this stop being fun?
Parents, log into ABC iView to stream the series.
Liam, this is Andy, and he's the father of our child.
Welcome, the love of my life, but also now very old.
We've been neighbours for years.
And yet I barely know you.
Sometimes life just happens.
I'm having my baby.
It arrives.
We can't go on like this.
I know. And you just have to deal with it.
Go find yourself. I feel like a therapist. You make a terrible therapist.
There's a whole part of me you've never seen.
Life, Sunday, ABC TV and ABC iView. From the sports page to the front page.
My whole life has been goal-driven.
Lisa Curry opens up on life in the spotlight.
Their whole family became so well known. You know, everybody felt that they knew them.
Nobody knows what happens behind closed doors.
And how loss has changed her.
She's very hard on herself, but Mum's a strong woman.
This was something that she couldn't fix.
It's not about medals. It's not about success and failure. It's about family. It's about love.
Australian Story, Monday at 8 on ABC TV and ABC iView.
This is a big business. The medical side of it doesn't seem to be a concern. Just making money. That's all they're in for.
Profiting from the pandemic.
It worries me when for-profits have discovered humanitarian disasters is like a gold strike.
Why would Aston Medical pay you that kind of money?
The company cashing in on COVID.
They knew it was risky, but yet they went ahead with it.
Four Corners, Monday, ABC TV and ABC iView.
My fellow Australians, right now everyone wants to buy your vote. So we're back to show you how your democracy is being sold and bring you all the inside information of how the pollies are trying to spin it to win it. Join our panel of experts, insiders and me, your election guide, Will Anthony Green.
Gruen Nation, Wednesday, May 11 on ABC TV and ABC iView. Spoken by Will Anderson and the voiceover guy who has to do this bit as fast as possible.
To keep streaming on ABC iView, you now need to log in with an ABC account. So log in and save something you want to enjoy later by adding it to your watch list. Pick up where you left off across logged-in devices. Plus, check out recommendations to unearth new shows and movies.
So, when does the show start?
Log in with an ABC account and make ABC iView yours.
Hello and welcome to the drama. I'm Ellen Fanning. Coming up, general practice under pressure, why it's getting so hard to get into the doctor. We look at what goes into the price you pay for stuff at the supermarket. And what's behind the cosmetic industry boom in Australia? Ouch. Ow. Ooh. Didn't like that picture. Joining me on the panel, Health and Communications Manager at the Gender Centre, Eloise Brooke. Lovely to meet you.
Lovely to meet you too.
New South Wales Liberal MP Michael Gabsley, former New South Wales Liberal MP Michael Gabsley.
Very formal.
Good to see you. In Brisbane tonight, columnist for Crikey and the New Daily, Madonna King. Always great to see you, Madonna.
You too, Ellen.
And in Melbourne tonight, infectious diseases expert Dr Kudzai Kanhutu. Hi, Kudzai.
Hi.
And you can join us on Twitter using the hashtag The Drum, and we're on Facebook. It's the end of week 3 of the federal election campaign, so of course we are at the point where the Australian Electoral Commission tells us about that candidate who nominated to run in 2 states for 2 different parties. If proven, that would be a breach of the Electoral Act. But here's the funny bit, his name will still appear on both ballots. It's been that kind of campaign. In case you missed it, the opposition leader is back in action, but his deputy has now gone down with COVID. But the government has had its own feverish moments this week, with confusion around climate policy, the ongoing Solomon Islands China issue, and alarming inflation numbers. So what do you answer, Madonna King, when people ask the question, who's winning?
I think at this point, it's like Groundhog Day. We've almost could wipe out these 3 weeks and start again. I think I'd probably in Queensland prefer to be in Scott Morrison's shoes than Anthony Albanese. Scott Morrison spent the last week largely in Queensland, and it was his, I think, clever and maybe shallow use of language about, you know, valuing the country, and he doesn't talk down to people. And we saw it again last night when he was talking to Anthony Albanese about COVID and saying, you know, I had the energy to do 12-hour days and the like. And I think he's playing, I wouldn't say dirty, but I think he is playing harder. And if you talk to people behind the scenes, certainly in Queensland, a state where the coalition has 23 of the 30 seats, the coalition aren't seeing many move, and Labor can tell you about one they'll probably win, or they hope to win, maybe 2. But given the performance of this government over the last 3 years, shouldn't they be talking about getting a swag of Labor of coalition seats?
Yeah, it's an extraordinary thing to remember that Labor holds 6 of the 30 federal seats in Queensland, and it's almost the reverse, Kudzai, in Victoria, where Labor holds 21 of the 38, soon probably 22 of 39, because there's a new seat being created due to population increase that's nominally Labor. It's almost the reverse, it seems, sentiment in Victoria when people are facing exactly the same issues.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of what's playing into a lot of that sentiment is, you know, what is actually happening at ground level and the experiences that Victoria has had as distinct from some of the other states around the relationship not only with state Labor, but then how that has fed up the chain to federal. So certainly what I'm seeing on that, there's not a huge shift. And in this last week where actually Anthony Albanese hasn't been front of centre and is having to do a sort of a Zoom campaign, it certainly hasn't felt like there's been a significant shift of sentiment at ground level at all, which is interesting because I think one of the things that's been lacking or has felt lacking is that there hasn't been a lot of energy or vibrancy about this campaign as opposed to previous years where you felt like there's a momentum building and people are getting excitement and there's a real sense of contest or shifting opinion. That hasn't really been apparent, and it's just sort of maybe slightly accentuating trends that were already there as opposed to really pivoting people's opinions.
And that is interesting because we're now seeing heckling from the sidelines, Eloise, from the AMA this afternoon, who are saying, hang on, I'll find it on my bit of paper, too many bits of paper, that they have heard crickets from both major parties on the crisis in our hospitals, which may well be something to do with the fact that it's the state governments that run the hospitals, but nevertheless they're saying, oh, where's the debate on the issues?
Look, I'm just excited that Anthony Albanese is back, and the political circus that has kind of been unfolding in the last 3 weeks. We've had Albanese off sick. We've had Scott Morrison kind of dodging and answering lots of different questions, but now he's in his element. And
Whose element? Who's in their element?
Scott Morrison is in his element. He is out on the hustings, he is talking to people, he is doing all those spots. This is what he's really, really good at. And I think we often forget that when he hits the tarmac and he's active, this is when he starts picking up voters. So I'm super excited to see what Anthony Albanese is going to do now that he's back. And it's kind of a story, right? Suddenly he's been out and now we've got the launch and here we go.
It remains the case, Michael, that it's really still Labor's election to lose, the commentators will have you believe, just in terms of the numbers, and that it will be quite the task for the coalition to kind of get to the 74 votes, perhaps with a couple of independents that they could hang on to form government. Did Scott Morrison really capitalise sufficiently on Albanese's absence this week?
I don't think he had to do much to capitalise on it other than be ScoMo on the hustings. And what Eloise said is absolutely true. Look, this guy is in his element. There are some politicians who are good campaigners. There are others who are the policy drivers. There are different skill sets. Campaigning, make no mistake, campaigning is a skill set. And what I'd say about the state of play so far is that the truth, we don't know. If the question is who is winning the election, the only honest answer is we don't know. If the question is who is winning the campaign, after 20 days, ScoMo is winning the campaign. Now, does that mean that you necessarily win the election? No, it doesn't. And there have been plenty of lessons in history where a particular party or leader has won the campaign but lost the election. So that's what we peer into the crystal ball to try and work out.
And also, Madonna, when you start to look at it at a more micro level, seat by seat and state by state, you start to see the sorts of pressures that are being applied and the sorts of different debates that are being had in different seats. How do One Nation and the Greens and other independents in Queensland force the major parties to have different conversations in individual seats?
I think that's such an astute question, Ellen, because I've covered elections now, as you have, probably for almost 3 decades. We did start when we were toddlers, I guess. but often you can say these are the issues. And yes, cost of living is an issue. Certainly interest rates will be next week, housing affordability, climate change. But that's the national narrative. In every electorate, there is a different focus. And I think the power of One Nation, the Greens and other independents, particularly in Queensland, where they're getting up to 22% of the vote, the Greens and One Nation in some electorates, what they are doing is changing the focus of the daily debate. So while that may not translate into independents or the smaller parties in Parliament, it may, but while it may not, on a daily basis, it is focusing the main parties on particular local issues. And that's why I think this is such a tricky election to call, unless a swing comes in that last week, and certainly in history that's happened before, but it's really difficult to discern the difference in the debate in Longman, say near Brisbane, to the debate somewhere in North Queensland, because it's such a locally driven campaign, and One Nation and the Greens are leading that in many ways.
That's interesting. And I was interested in the seat of Brisbane. So there's a sitting LNP member. So this is an inner city electorate. Same as any inner city electorate. The Greens are in the ascendants, but it's held by the LNP. I looked it up. The most common non-English language in the electorate, Madonna, is Mandarin.
Yeah.
And so here you've got the debate about the Solomons. You've got the Prime Minister out again today saying that Sogavare is taking his lines from Beijing, or words to that effect. I mean, that may well play in other places, but I'm not sure it would play in that sort of 5% marginal seat of Brisbane.
If you were going to look at one seat in Queensland, Brisbane is the one. And the reason for that is, yes, it was held by Labor. Remember Arch Bevis in 2010, and for the last 12 years, yes, it's been held by the Liberals. But the Greens have been in ascendancy, and if you translate their vote in booths at local election or the state election, you can see, and I think last time in 2019, they got 22% of that vote. But that is the seat, the only seat that I think Labor behind the scenes are now kind of got in the ticked box because they believe their candidate, she's a director at Deloitte, Madonna Jarrett, very good. She will have to beat the Greens though to get there. But I think that probably will be the first and maybe even the only seat that will fall out of the LNP hat.
Yeah.
Ellen, may I just make this point? I mean, I don't think it's overstating it for a moment to say that this is potentially the most significant shift in Australian politics that we have seen since World War II. What does that mean? What I'm saying is that there is a new third force in Australian politics, and we're talking about the Homes of Court, Greens 200, Teals, whatever they want to call themselves.
And you think that's real? Because at the beginning of the campaign, everyone was saying, no, listen, you're going to get excited because there's these independent candidates and it's a bit boring covering the coalition and Labor, but don't be, they're just a little bit of razzle-dazzle on the side, and don't be seduced by them in your coverage. So did we get bored, or is it a real force?
Well, look, my view is that it is absolutely real. And what Madonna is saying about the Greens, of course, is absolutely the case. But bear in mind that apart from Adam Bant in the lower house, that has really been their only showing in the House of Representatives. I think potentially we are looking at a swag of independents entering the House of Representatives.
Would you care to put on the record which one?
No. It's probably best if I don't. But we know they're
value you member of the Liberal Party.
They're standing
the
in.
card there. You want to keep
they're
it?
They're standing in. Look, I mean, I know that election campaigns are often you're meant to tread gently. I mean, I don't actually go along with that. I think it's better to call it as you see it, and how I see it is that potentially I think we are looking at very, very major changes. They are standing in 20 plus seats. These seats are carefully targeted. I'm certainly of the view that they can call themselves independents for all they like. I mean, the evidence suggests otherwise. I mean, the term independent is a very benign, cuddly term, which I think is something of a charade.
Why would that matter?
Because people out there listen to these labels in the same way as they listen to Liberal and Labor. The word independent is a very loaded, cuddly term.
Okay. Could I, the thing that has hijacked the election, if I may, is potentially reality. So that inflation figure this week of 5.1%. Next week, we're liable to see the Reserve Bank of Australia increase official interest rates, which will flow through, no doubt, to bank interest rates. And the week after that, we will have the wages figures, and we already know that wages are trailing behind the level of inflation. So the amount of money you take home in real terms, everyone's getting a pay cut. Are you starting to see that stress, that real human stress, come through in the patients that you see?
Absolutely, but it's not a case of it's something that we had never seen before. So pre-pandemic, working in a lot of the healthcare services I work in, it was very apparent that people were under economic and financial stress beforehand. What has changed is really individually, people's circumstances have changed in really peculiar ways. So there are some people who've been able to have more savings, and that's sort of a general trend, but it's what they then spend their money on after, now that they're sort of coming out of the pandemic. What are people spending that additional disposable income on, through to the people that we know never had any disposable income, where coming for a clinic appointment was always going to be stressful because it's time away from work. There's transportation stress, there's childcare, stress around how do I actually manage my life. I think the one thing that has stood out in the pandemic and where we're emerging from now is really the way that we've had to respond and up our ability and skill set around detecting what financial stress looks like across the spectrum. So once upon a time, we'd look for your classical, homeless person, where it's really destitution that you're looking for, markers of destitution. Now what we're having to finesse is how do we detect financial stress in somebody who you'd term as middle class or, more, higher income bracket, and really teasing out what that looks like. And often in people who have been used to having money and have lost it, it doesn't manifest as destitution. They've still got their home. It can actually manifest as what we'd class as behaviours of concern. So people who are obstreperous or difficult to engage with. And when you actually lift the hood of that distress, it's a conversation about financial distress and how different people express their financial distress is, I think, one of the challenges we've had in our healthcare delivery is how do we get that nuance and actually pick it up in different people who don't represent as your classical, person experiencing financial distress.
Thank you for that insight. One of the government's most consistent lines is that they provide the best economic option, pointing to the current unemployment rate. For example, Wednesday's inflation results, as we say, puts that line under some pressure, reinforcing as it does the low wage environment and the likely impact on interest rates, although the Treasurer is at pains to point out that international pressures are at play there. Well, one of the quickest tells for inflation is groceries. Same basket of goods, much higher price. David Taylor has a look at just how that works and why you end up bearing the cost.
Every product in a supermarket has a price. But have you ever thought about what makes up that price?
Take a packet of Tim Tams, for example. You've got the ingredients, cocoa beans sourced from Africa. And of course you've got manufacturing costs. That could be anything from electricity and the cost of packaging the product. Then transport and logistics, getting the Tim Tams from the factory to the warehouse and then of course to the supermarket. And within the supermarket, you've got the staff to put the product onto the shelf. Now it all comes to produce a final cost of the product that should be less than $2.50.
The price you'll see in the store between $2.50 and $4 is higher than that to ensure the company makes a profit. That price is usually determined by a supermarket purchase or category manager. They've got quite the job, securing the product from the farm gate or factory for the lowest possible cost and selling it on to the supermarket floor for the highest possible price, taking into account competition pricing.
Macquarie research came out finding that fresh produce and meat products were growing at somewhere between 6 and 6.5% food price inflation. So when that shopping dollar seems to be going up $8 or $10 every week, it's a combination of things. It's dry groceries, it's bakery products, it's meat and it's fresh produce.
The final cost the supermarket category manager accepts comes about via two main ways. Fixed contracts that range from a couple of months to several years.
So the first way retail prices are set is through negotiation between a retailer and a manufacturer or a supplier of those goods. That contract might be 12 months, it might be up to 5 years.
While other agreements with suppliers can be week to week.
So basically how much product's coming into the market at that particular point in time, a negotiation is made between selling agents and buying agents to see what the price will be set for the day.
But the price of a product you see on the supermarket shelf needs to satisfy one group of people first and foremost, the company's shareholders. During the height of the Omicron outbreak last year, supermarkets had a heyday. Elevated prices and record demand in their stores amid panic buying saw the share market prices of both supermarket chains at or near record highs.
And that naturally gets to a point where shareholders say, well, we want better return on our investment. You need to do something with either your costs or your retail price.
It makes you wonder if prices really need to be as high as they are.
It's an interesting one, Eloise. We saw the Prime Minister to say that, look, today there was much talk of $5 iceberg lettuce and there's not necessarily much the government can do about the price of lettuce, and yet the government claims credit for a whole bunch of other economic outcomes. How difficult does that messaging start to become?
that becomes really, really difficult. People are not going to take the time to distinguish what it is that might be on separate lists that you could buy or not buy. I mean, the attention span, as important as elections are for some of us, I think for the great majority of people, the messaging has to be straightforward. It has to be clear. It can't be, we're good on this, but we're not good on this. It opens you up for more attack and for contradiction, which I think that the Prime Minister, this is something that he has to be very mindful.
Is it a bit tough to have it both ways, Michael? The inflation, I mean, regardless of reality, the inflation is as a result of at the petrol bowser of what's happening in Ukraine. Fruit and veg, that's probably a bit to do with drought and all the rest of it. The cost of building materials going up, well, that's supply chain shortages as a result of COVID. But is the electorate really going to sit down and listen to all that, or they're just going to go, how much for that thing that used to cost me? You were 110? That basket of goods would never cost that much.
Look, if the government had the option of saying what can we cross off the list to make sure it doesn't happen during the next 6 weeks, the 6 weeks of the election campaign, you would opt for keeping inflation low and not having an interest rate rise. Now, the two things, those two things on the wish list are not about to be granted, and people will cast their votes against the background of both of those wallops taking place, assuming there is an interest rate rise, and that's the way it's heading. Is that controllable? No, it's not. It's not, and it's really one of the strengths of Australian economic management that those things are not within the gift of government. That is,
despite what Clive Palmer's United Australia Party says, that they'll guarantee a 3% interest rate. Presumably, you'd have to have a whole bunch of blokes in reflecto sunnies and military uniforms going down and taking the Reserve Bank board hostage and saying, "We've got news for you guys."
As Eloise and I were just saying, I mean, Clive Palmer with his $200 million war chest is capable of saying anything, and he does say anything. I don't think he's going to see a seat for his $200 million. And frankly, we should be very thankful for that. I mean, I think this is
You think Australians have seen through him now?
Oh, look, I think this is about the most alarming example you could imagine of democracy for sale. It's just that Clive is a bit of a nutter.
But he might deliver votes for the LNP.
Well, yeah, look, I agree.
We're getting off the topic.
Margins.
Yeah, we're getting off the topic. Madonna, this is a bizarre moment, and it's a tough one to cover because we have this inflationary environment, but it's essentially on the supply side, as we've said. Ukraine, COVID supply, that's what's driving up the cost of wood for every house and all the rest of it. And all an interest rate rise is going to do, necessary though the Reserve Bank of Australia may deem it to be, is make the cost of living even sharper, make the squeeze even worse for people who are already experiencing a squeeze and already potentially reducing their expenditure as a result.
Yeah, the winner of next week will be the person who is able to sell their message. So the coalition will be selling the fact that we are the better economic managers because the economy is strong. That's why the inflationary impact we're seeing, that's why we've got to have interest rate rise, for example. The Labor opposition is going to do exactly the opposite. Is this the first step in a stairwell of interest rates? And I was trying to think of the last time this happened. It was probably 2007. John Howard was going to probably lose that election anyway, but the inflation was at 3%, not at 5.1%. Interest rates went up during the campaign. John Howard came out and apologised. Well, I don't think that's going to happen next week. And he ended up losing the election, although I think it wasn't on the interest rates. Scott Morrison is good on the messaging. But what I think voters will think is this a one-off, this interest rate rise? Or is it a pattern that starts next week? And I think how both parties sell that message and whoever succeeds will probably be the big call, but probably will win certainly next week and maybe the election.
New South Wales Premier Dominic Perrottet has met today with the independent MP Alex Greenwich and representatives from the trans community, including our panellist here, Eloise Brooke, who's from the Gender Centre. The meeting was called after Greenwich threatened to withdraw his critical support from the minority New South Wales government. Now, that was in response to this comment from the Premier, which in turn was in response to the criticism of federal Warringah candidate Catherine Deeves for her comments relating to transgender children.
My personal view is that when it comes to competitive sport, that young girls should compete against young girls. I think we should have a common sense approach to it and approach the issue in a sensitive way. That's exactly what I said, and I believe my views are more in line with fair-minded Australians than yours.
Independent MP Alex Greenwich then said he was considering whether to continue to give the government his support for supply.
It's my hope that we can reach a position of mutual respect and an understanding of the importance to support young trans people and all trans people to ensure that they can really flourish and be loved members, fully loved members of the society by politicians, because they are by the public.
So, Eloise, you were one of 8 people, along with Alex, in this meeting. 8 trans people?
It was a mix of trans representatives, but it was a parent and also a sports reps as well.
Okay. And so you're a trans woman sitting in there with the Premier. You've been given half an hour to talk to the Premier.
That's right.
Who essentially has been shanghaied into this meeting by the Greens MP, who says, have this meeting or you may not be in government next week. So what was the mood of the Premier?
Well, let me clarify. Alex is not a Greens member.
Oh, sorry,
he's
an independent.
Yeah.
There's that word again.
It's the I word.
The I word. So, look, he was very gracious. He came and met with us. I felt at the start of it that he was not quite sure why he was there, in a sense that he felt that his words were reflective of the wider opinion within the community. But he took the time to sit with us, and he heard us all out. We got to tell the stories that we needed to tell. We got to talk about the experience of families. We got to talk about how sporting in Australia looks right now and how it has been for some time. We heard from a father who was very distressed about his experience of trying to take care of a young trans girl in the middle of all of this.
And what did he say?
Well, he said that his daughter was doing really, really well. And this is frequently what we see.
So what were the comments that his daughter had had to hear that had caused her distress and that he'd had to work to insulate her against?
So fortunately, that family had been doing an amazing job to make sure that that girl was not exposed. And the reality is that when you take trans and gender diverse children in their families and you place them in an environment like community sport or any kind of community activities, then you can't help but love them because they're beautiful and they're just like everyone else's kids, and they contribute, and their parents work incredibly hard. Their parents are coaches, their parents, are team managers. They do all of the work because of the benefits of sport and the benefits of community on children, and in particular on trans children.
So the Premier said, and you were speaking to me earlier, that something that he thought was sort of self-evident. Well, girls should play girls and boys should play boys. Were you able to explain to him why that was such a difficult thing to hear, a damaging thing to hear?
I did, and I think that.
What did you say?
Well, what I said to him is I gave him the example of a young trans girl, and I found this story out this week because we often deal with these stories. Her mother told us at the Gender Centre that she had been taken home from school because she'd been approached in the schoolyard by some other kids who basically told her that she, because of the words of the Premier and because of the words of the Prime Minister, that she didn't deserve the same respect that everyone else had. And then they beat her up. So I made it really clear to the Premier that his words, even though he had no intention of causing that to happen and that it's not his fault, but the effect of his words was to allow these kinds of behaviour within the community.
So your Gender Centre, or the Gender Centre, is often the place that is the first port of call for families, for schools, for trans individuals. So you're speaking with that authority. Did the Premier accept that his words had that effect?
We didn't get to a point where he necessarily apologised, but it was very clear that he was taking it seriously. All of the people in that room, with their very particular expertise, were able to illuminate an aspect of trans lives, sport, families for me, and some of the other reps as well. And he got a much more complex picture of what families face.
And did you watch him change over that time?
I did. Like I think I mentioned that to start with, he felt like, what am I even doing in this room? I like trans people, this is not an issue. And then for him to understand that this was far more complex. And I should state that the New South Wales government, departments like health and community justice, work with trans organisations and trans people, and worked with the Gender Centre to help improve the lives of trans people. So his own government is already moving in that direction. What really affected him, and at the time we all find this relatively amusing, was that when we told him that perhaps New South Wales was nowhere near as good as, say, Victoria when it came to supporting the trans community, he was like, oh, what? as in New South Wales is not as good as Victoria. that kind of definitely came across, and it was said in the spirit of you know, that we all found that kind of insightful and amusing, and didn't take offence at that. But that's what we had.
Kudzai, there's been a lot of debate, and I sort of have watched Tracy Holmes, our wonderful sports expert, really, here at the ABC, sort of bemused, saying sports had rules around all of this. The IOC's grappled with this issue, but because it's in the news, let me ask the dumb questions, right? Wouldn't a trans woman always be better at sport than a cis woman?
No, and I think this is something that's been reflected quite well in the IOC framework, or the new framework that they applied at the Tokyo Olympics. And Laurel Hubbard competed in that Olympics.
So she's a trans woman from...
Yeah, as a trans woman from New Zealand.
Right, yeah.
So I think part of the framework was really based around humanity first, humanity, fairness as well, but acknowledging that our concept of biological gender and this presumption of superiority based on testosterone has really moved away from how we contend with notions of gender, and that what we should be moving towards is those other aspects around humanity, inclusivity, and still making the point that from my experience with people who are transitioning and trans people is that this conversation about extreme, elite sports it's not the focus of the conversations
Most
that people
of us
have in
don't play
families.
elite sport.
It's not the focus.
But just with the dumb questions, right? So presumably there's no biological performance difference between boys and girls until you get to puberty. And then we never seem to have a discussion about girls transitioning to boys. That never seems to come up. But boys transitioning to girls, if they are suppressing testosterone, presumably they are suppressing muscle mass and haemoglobin, which allows you to go faster longer. Would that be just the basic biology of it?
Look, yeah, and there are other discussions that have been had as well about other competitive advantages like height, which are not purely prescribed by your sex chromosomes either. So if we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of what actually confers competitive advantage, then we're going to need to
people with eye-hand coordination. They should
broadly.
Go and get.
Yeah, and really move away from this very rigid binary concept of what confers competitive advantage. And you're quite right in making the point that at the junior sports level, it's a conversation that really should be null and void. And all of the conversations at that elite spectrum of sports, they've been had And there are really some neat frameworks that are helping people to contend with that. But where we seem to be focusing the conversation at that junior level, it just seems a really kind of redundant conversation. And I would be really remiss to think that there are children that are missing out on social connectivity and, you know, the enjoyment of sport and community because, you know, people have these sort of misguided concepts of some sort of natural advantage that is conferred by chromosomes alone.
And the other thing about sport that we see, you know, in our community fields, when you know, that we take our kids to play sport on, you know, we always come across that team where, you know, they're 11 and 12-year-olds, and maybe there's a bunch of 11-year-olds who are 4 nothing, and there's a couple of them who are maybe 5'5" and heading up. And the answer to that is, as a team, when faced with the dazzling defence or that 6 tall 14-year-old, is not to kind of chuck the towel in, but is to kind of hunker around and say, how are we going to win this match as a team? You either win it or you lose it. But that's the importance of sport, and that's that communal importance, that win or lose, you do it with other people and you learn how to do it, especially for kids. Now, if you exclude trans young people and children from the benefits of sport, then the knock-on effects are terrible for mental health. They need to be on those sports fields and they contribute.
Madonna, you are forever talking to young people, and you've got a book coming out where you've interviewed 1,000 girls. Talk to me about what they think about these sorts of issues.
What beautiful comments previously. 1,000 girls, 16, 17 and 18. And I wish this wasn't a conversation about sport and transgender, because in our schools and in our homes, this is a much bigger issue. Now, only 1.3% of the population are transgender, but the experts I spoke to said up to 15% of girls, and this is girls to boys, 15% of girls who are 16, 17 and 18 are looking at their gender, trying to work out who they are, exploring who they are. And I think what we're missing in this whole political debate is that cohort, but not only that cohort, this beautiful group of teenagers, more than perhaps we did, like to leave room for others so they can see that their friends are grappling with this. So this is a really significant issue for schools working out about unisex toilets, whether that private schools, whether they have shorts as well as skirts in uniforms. Boarding schools are going through all sorts of things. School boards, you're not hearing it publicly, but going through hell. Parents are writing letters saying, you know, I'm sending my child to a girls' school. Why are you allowing this? And what all this is forgetting is that a significant chunk of our girls, and presumably boys, but my research isn't a girls, are going through hell. And their parents are going through hell trying to work out what to do and how to guide them and whether this is acceptable or it's not what their grandmother would have thought. So how do they think? And in reducing this to something that is about sport, which is just ridiculous, we are adding to the mental health legacy here, and we are not discussing this as a real issue. And to be honest, Eloise, I think you are so lovely saying what you said about the Premier, but I really don't think the Premier, the Prime Minister in his comments, or almost any politician I've heard actually understand the role of gender identity in our teenagers now. Now, most of them, all except for 1.3, will decide that they are not transgender. That doesn't mean they're not going through that process now and wanting guidance and help. And to turn on the television or listen to the radio and hear our politicians talk in the way they do, how do they feel? How do their parents feel? How do schools take guidance from that? And better for our teenagers.
I was going to say that.
I'll get off my high horse now.
Good on you. I'm so passionate because you've talked to so many kids about it, and you've really truly listened to them, and I think it's wonderful that you advocate like that.
I talk to girls who are Googling how to become a boy late at night so their parents don't find it. Girls ringing psychologists trying to get in because they don't know how to have that conversation. And as adults and as policymakers and as medicos, isn't our job to actually help them.
Yeah.
And the whole debate is doing anything other than that.
Eloise?
And the load that's placed on families in New South Wales, and I can speak about New South Wales, is immense. So the Gender Centre last year supported 334 families with specific casework support. And of those, 67 of those families was on suicide watch. That means that one of those parents is at home all the time to keep an eye on that young person. That can go on for years. The strain that places on that family unit when your income drops to just one or two part-time, plus the strain upon the relationship, plus the airwaves being filled with hateful anti-trans rhetoric that we continue to see. This is the third week of the campaign, and families are doing it really tough.
Michael, it seems that the issue becomes a proxy for fairness. You know, what's fair on the sporting field? And that there ought to be rules in society that ensure common sense is a word that keeps coming up, and fairness is a word that keeps coming up. And I wonder, is that a proxy for, I mean, this trans issue is so unlikely to affect 90% of, 99%, 98% of people. Is this a proxy for something else?
Look, I get what you're saying about common sense and fairness, but I would put something higher than either of those, and that is empathy. I mean, if you track back 3 weeks ago when this whole sort of meltdown in the context of Australian politics happened on the trans issue.
But can I just say, this Catherine Deves was deliberately chosen and her views were known, right? So candidates are chosen for their values and their record in a way that means I'm happy to have that person and I'm happy to have her views advanced. So it's no surprise that we're having this conversation.
No,
that's not a surprise.
It's not.
It was
deliberate.
deliberate.
Not a surprise.
It was deliberate.
Yep.
So what is that about? Is it trying to trigger this broader conversation about political correctness and fairness and common sense? What is it whistling to somebody else?
All I would say in relation to Catherine Deves is that her language has no place in this discussion. You could treat it the easy way and say it was a bad choice of words, but I think
is there another way to say it?
Well,
is there another way to raise that issue in a federal election? Because is it really about tone and how she formulates the sentences?
I think
it was a bit more than just a couple of misspoken or bad.
Oh look, I agree,
it was targeted,
and that's why I'm saying you could be gentle and say bad choice of words. It was more than that. It was worse than that,
yeah.
And I'm saying there is no place for the sort of language that she used. And I think what comes, but these things do actually provide some learning experiences for people, and Eloise must be, you must be dealing with them a lot. The truth is that this is for a lot of people who are involved in public policy and politics, something of a brave new world. And it shouldn't be, and a lot of learning has to be done in short order to make sure the sort of offensive things that were said are no longer part of our vocabulary.
It's more than offence, though. I hear what you're saying, and I acknowledge that learning is important, but it's more than just people taking offence about things. These are people, these are families, these are a community, my community, which is under load, and it just essentially wants to be able to do what everyone else does without having the kinds of hurdles placed in our way. So offence is a word perhaps when we have a disagreement about ideas. I don't believe this is a disagreement about ideas. I think there is media and stories that are coming out of America that are very extreme, and there's an opportunity, or some media and politicians are seeing this package say, Leah Thomas, the trans swimmer, the college level trans swimmer. They're saying, you Butte, let's take this and transpose it onto the Australian landscape. And it doesn't transpose.
Okay. Just a final question, and it seems flippant, but it's not. Is the government in New South Wales secure as a result of your meeting today?
It sounded like you'll have to ask Alex Greenwich for his final word, but he seemed very happy that he had been heard. It looked okay.
Okay.
I think we're okay this weekend.
Okay. And if this topic has raised any issues for you, please call Lifeline 131114 or Kids Helpline on 1800 55 1800. You're watching The Drum, and with me on the panel, Health and Communications Manager at the Gender Centre, Eloise Brooke, former New South Wales Liberal MP Michael Yabsley, in Brisbane, columnist for Crikey and The New Daily, Madonna King, and in Melbourne tonight, infectious diseases expert Dr Kudzai Kanhutu. Have you tried, are you right, Michael?
Yes, yeah.
Have you tried to get, you can't cough like that in Australia anymore. I mean, what did we used to say? That we used to cough to cover a fart, now we fart to cover a cough. Am I allowed to say that on the telly? I just did. Have you tried to get an appointment with the doctor lately for either end of you? With COVID cases still running through the community, it seems harder than ever to see the GP for anything. GPs and pharmacists report they are struggling to keep up with demand, and the wait can be life-threatening, as the AM program heard from Ashley this morning.
Quite sudden, and we thought, oh, you know, we'll get him a doctor's appointment, and yeah, they were weeks away. Not that I thought he was ever going to take his life, but yeah, the very next day. So I was right, he did need help, but yeah, we didn't think it was going to come to that.
Just in the past week, 4 major Victorian regional hospitals issued code yellows, which signal an internal emergency with delivering services. And an investigation is underway into the death of a 72-year-old man who died in an emergency department bathroom after waiting 3 hours for help. Locum doctor and immediate past president of the Rural Doctors Association of Australia, Dr John Hall, says rural health has gone off the radar.
So we have doctors that work in emergency, the same doctor then delivers babies, does caesarean sections, and the same doctors provide anaesthetics or put people to sleep for procedures. And often it's the same doctors who are providing community general practice care in the community as well. I believe, and the Rural Doctors Association believe, that it's a basic human right that communities have access to emergency care, cancer care, birthing, and good quality general practice. In the last 20 years, there's been over 150 rural maternity units that have closed. That means across 150 sites, you can no longer have your baby in community. The babies still keep coming. So in these communities, you end up with babies being delivered in a hospital with no midwives, with no operating theatre, with no services to manage some of those difficult and often early or preterm unexpected births. We've seen poor outcomes happening because of it. There are models of care popping up around the country now where some of the care is being provided by telehealth. That's better than nothing, but it doesn't replace hands on the ground. You can't give someone CPR over the telephone or video. You can't intubate someone or put them in an induced coma over the telephone, and you certainly can't deliver babies over a video conference.
Kudzai, we'll just quiz you on this if we can. Why is this not an election issue when everyone's talking about it?
It should be, and in many respects from medical circles it is an election issue, because this is not a topic that's new, and a lot of the factors that were unpacked there in terms of the stresses of working in an area where you don't have sufficient supports within your organisation to actually deliver care are chronic. They've been there for decades, and there's been various policy moves to try and address that and try and recruit and retain people into rural regional practice, as we should. But a lot of the factors that are making people not stay or not allowing people to actually end up there haven't changed, and that starts upstream. I myself chose to do 1 year of my training in rural and regional New South Wales, and through that experience I saw that a lot of medical courses upstream, you don't get much exposure to community general practice, let alone rural and regional. And yet when we look downstream at the sorts of people who end up choosing to stay, it's people who've had experience and exposure when they're training and know the richness and the reward that comes from having that connection to community and finding a place within a community and actually making that long-term contribution. But there's a real mismatch at all stages of the medical profession around encouraging people to stay, and then the realities and the practicalities which perhaps weren't alluded to as much there around if you are a rural general practitioner. The business models are no longer viable in a lot of instances. You can't actually make do and work and have a reasonable work-life balance with the kind of sort of Medicare rebates that you can hope to obtain if you're setting up business there.
Yeah. Well, all those video calls we made during the pandemic have apparently left some people feeling increasingly image conscious. And that low self-esteem is fueling a cosmetic surgery boom, apparently, in Australia. The industry is now worth $1 billion a year. And treatments like Botox and derma fillers are becoming more and more accessible and affordable. A new RN podcast called Face Value has had a look at what's driving the growth.
You know, watching the Kardashians, like, I feel like you can kind of just assume they were like surgically enhanced, and I just thought they were so gorgeous. So I think that's when I started like realizing, oh wow. So I'm Kylie's age, and I pretty much watched her evolve, you know, turned 17, 18. That's when she started like physically changing a lot. And I think that was like, oh my God, like this is so cool. And that's pretty much why I got my first meal on my lips when I was 18, because like it changed her look entirely. And I was like, I need that.
ABC journalist Siobhan Murrin fronts the podcast and she joins me now. Thank you so much for being here. Siobhan, I remember the global financial crisis, being in Manhattan and somebody saying to me, all these middle-aged men in finance are getting fillers and all the rest of it. Has Zoom just caused another resurgence of all this?
It's funny you mentioned that, because I do think older generations, middle-aged, 40s up, etc., there's a bit more keeping mum about the situation as to whether you've had work done. But amongst younger generations, they are way more happy to share what they have had done on TikTok and other platforms. But yes, if we're talking about video conferencing programs like Zoom and Skype, they've actually messed with our minds. You know, you're always on all day, you're like doing your meetings, but you can see yourself in the corner, right? And so you're looking at yourself in this probably an unflattering angle, you know, the camera
up
is...
your nose.
Exactly.
And you keep moving it and thinking, would more light help, would less light help? And you just look dreadful. But then you turn the camera off and they say, what's happened? And you say, it's broken. It's broken, I'm sorry about that. And you're just E on the screen.
I think that's a good idea to go with that. I haven't tried it, but maybe I will now. But yeah, essentially, it's not a flattering angle. You probably have bad lighting in your house. And so you're seeing a distorted version of what you actually look like and thinking, oh, I don't look great. It's something that a Harvard professor, Shadi Korosh, has actually coined Zoom dysmorphia. And it's leading to a lot of people wanting to get work done, in particular anti-wrinkle treatments like Botox, because also when we're looking at screens all day, we're squinting a lot more. And you don't do that when you're looking in the mirror, right?
Michael, I don't know about this. I only ask because we're much the same age. Shall we try that? You try first.
Well, what do you think, Ellen? Should I?
I don't know. Pull harder.
There is more chance of Clive Palmer becoming Prime Minister than me having that done. But I do that every now and then. You know, it's almost embarrassing to talk about, isn't it?
You wonder. You wonder. Tell me the story about your mother. Will she mind?
No, I don't. I don't think so. No, look, I was thinking. Would she think it was funny, or would she be horrified?
Too late now.
We needn't worry about that. Look, when she was in her mid 60s, she decided she was going to get rid of her turkey's neck. You know what? It's
gobble gobble.
Which is, I guess, it strikes me as something that happens more to women than men.
I don't know about that.
I've surveyed this pretty closely, and I think that's the answer. And look, I remember being horrified. This was up in the country. I'm from Lismore, and she said, in a quite a pointed way, this is what I'm going to have done. And I thought, oh my God, yeah. She went ahead, And it was a fantastic success. This was all she had done was that the removal of the turkey's neck, and she looked fantastic. And so that, I guess, was my first and really only experience of cosmetic surgery and what might happen, which is why I do that every now and then.
But Siobhan, restoration is different from renovation, and there's a lot of needles these days, and they're not particularly well regulated, are they?
No, not exactly. It's quite horrifying that if you're a doctor or a nurse, you can very easily become a cosmetic injector. It's quite regular for people to do like a weekend course, and then they have access to it. And also, if you just go into a shopping centre anywhere now, Ellen, you will see places that are offering Botox, dermal fillers at quite cheap prices. But I guess from a consumer point of view, you're not really sure how trained they are when they're injecting you. So it is quite scary. I haven't actually heard or gotten too much into the turkey surgery that's been mentioned, but that's interesting.
Just before I go to Madonna, can I be really rude and get you to frown? Siobhan, how old are you? Frown, go on, frown. Yeah, she's clean. Madonna, share your weekend beauty regime with me, doll.
I'm still getting over Siobhan saying, the older generation, you know those people over 40.
I took that badly too. Yeah.
I took that. So I plan to shave my legs and get rid of the roots of my hair. That's probably about as far as I go. But, you know, it is such an important issue. Snapchat surgery is something that Siobhan would know about too. You know, young girls putting a filter on their phone, going into a plastic surgeon and saying, can I look like this? And doctors in America have for now several years just pleaded with people to turn their bloody phone off. And we need to do the same thing here because the same requests are being made of medicos here.
Kudzai, you've got 1 minute to talk some sense into it.
Well, I think the most important thing, and there's a trend in the UK towards this, is that women, girls, men all need to start appreciating what actually goes behind some of this magic of people looking the way that they do. And once you sort of lift the lid on what it actually takes, I hope it might restore some normalcy about what a normal face and what a normal body looks like. And that should be the goal, that people can actually accept what they got out of the box and learn to get more comfortable with it so that they don't feel this pressure to look like something that's either unattainable or just taken huge amounts of money, time and effort to achieve and then obtain, and sometimes with some questionable practices and you know, that ability to actually follow up over time what the long-term impacts are for your body. And just get used to your factory settings. It's not all that bad.
So botulism in your face, fillers in your face, is there any risk on that? I worry that doesn't seem like a very good thing to do, Kudzai. That seems a bit dangerous, does it?
Well, look, Botox is actually something that's been used in medical practice for quite some time.
Okay,
so neurologists use it, rehab. The fillers are problematic for me because not only the practitioners who supply some of the fillers and some of the processes that go into determining what's safe and where in a group of people that are often quite, you know, don't have the benefit of really informed choice.
So big question mark there. Siobhan, thank you for coming on and inspiring that conversation. We've forgiven you for your comments about the over 40s. You've got 5 seconds if you want to say something. Quick.
Oh, please don't be offended by that. I think you all look beautiful on the panel. But yeah, there's a lot of interesting issues that we do explore in the podcast.
All right, we look gorgeous. Good night.
Making miniatures calls for surprising ingredients.
Emu feathers.
Tea bags.
Rhubarb seeds.
Fish tank stocking.
The tiny team turn their attention to 19th century Adelaide.
This photo is like gold.
And an aerial adventure that caused quite a stir.
There's no safety harness.
Crazy.
Tiny Oz.
It's so quiet. It's
Tuesday 8:30 on ABC TV and streaming on ABC iView.
This is the story you have been waiting to hear.
Who's up for
The best family time viewing. Ready to go anytime.
Get out there. Have a look.
Sometimes you have to do the stupid things.
You're onto something, aren't you?
Entertainment the whole family can enjoy.
Yes!
Okay, you ready?
It's always very exciting.
Cheers to us.
Stream for free. Log in to ABC iView.
Well, 90 years doesn't seem a long time to me. I feel exactly the same as I did when I was very young, except looking in the mirror is a bit of a shock.
I've had a love affair with horses since the day I was born.
A horse is an amazing animal. You have a connection of the minds.
It's good, isn't it?
RDA is Riding for the Disabled Association. It's been a treasured part of my life. I've just met extraordinary people all my life. Horses are incredible because they seem to know with people's disabilities. You get back from the children much more than you ever give. Oh, it's wonderful. People with disabilities have achieved so much, so much. I'm Aileen and I'm 90 years young.
Excitement and apprehension. The removal of Western Australia's mask mandate gets a mixed reception. The man accused of raping Liberal staffer Brittany Higgins inside Parliament House will stand trial in the ACT Supreme Court. Struggling to put food on the table. Household staples being priced out of reach for many. And a super-sized swell in the southwest. Margaret River turns it up for the Pro Tour. This is ABC Late News. Hello, I'm Brianna Shepherd. Western Australians have entered a new phase of living with COVID after several key restrictions were removed overnight. And with daily cases still only slightly below the COVID peak, people have embraced restriction-free living with a mixture of excitement and trepidation.
This is Northbridge, restriction-free at midnight. No proof of vax, no capacity limits, and no more masks. At school, many were ready to ditch their masks as well, but not everyone.
Why have you chosen to wear it still?
Because I guess COVID is still around. It's not gone yet, so well, I want to be safe.
She doesn't like them very much, do you?
No.
Good morning, how are you?
For CBD barista Yasmin, it's made communicating easier, but it's an adjustment.
I can feel the bruise on my face today. It feels really strange.
An adjustment too for her regulars on their way to work, and hopefully some new faces finished with working from home.
Kind of liberating a little bit, yeah. But yeah, like I say, I'm still a bit wary about it. I don't know if I should or not.
Weird seeing people's faces, yeah.
Well, I'm going to have to watch for my facial features now and not let slip if I'm being grumpy. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to it.
Also back to work today was the Premier.
Hi, how are you?
Off to Rottnest to promise clean energy funding and encourage people to embrace their new freedoms.
It's the right time to make this decision. The advice is we've gone past our peak. We're now declining in numbers of positive cases, and each and every day our vaccination levels go up.
Oh, cute.
But not everyone is convinced.
Restrictions are to flatten the curve. So if you reduce restrictions, then you can see the line go upwards. Given that we're only 9% less than where we were in late March, there is a concern that we could end up with a second peak.
With more than 8,000 new cases, the AMA is among those concerned WA's moved too soon. About 2 months ago, the Premier was here on a Friday afternoon when 9 people caught COVID in this same pub in just a couple of hours. And that was when masks were mandated and the state only had about 500 active cases. There's now more than 43,000.
Cheers.
James Carmody, ABC News.
Power prices are another cost of living pressure being debated this election, with the cost of electricity soaring in recent months. Returning to the campaign trail after recovering from COVID, Labor leader Anthony Albanese is spruiking his party's plan to build more transmission infrastructure, while the coalition is focused on hydrogen power. Here's political reporter Melissa Clark.
Out of COVID ISO
and back on the campaign trail.
I certainly feel much better today than I did yesterday.
The hip pocket remains the focus on the hustings.
We know that the cost of everything is going up, but people's wages just aren't.
The external influences on the economy are going to continue.
Electricity is among the household bills getting bigger. Wholesale power prices have risen 67% in 3 months and 141% compared to the same time last year. The price hikes are greatest in Queensland and New South Wales because of surging international demand for black coal, damage to the Callide B coal-fired power station and constraints in the electricity grid. It's those constraints in transmission that Labor is focused on, promising $20 billion of upgrades to the grid to help integrate more renewables.
If we get this right, if we fix the grid, we will see those energy prices drop by $275 by 2025.
Yeah, OK.
The Coalition argues many of those upgrades are unnecessary and what's needed is more firming power to back up renewables.
That's why we have invested in Snowy 2.0. That's why we're doing Battery of the Nation. That's why we've invested in gas-fired power in Kurri Kurri.
For industry, hydrogen has the potential to be a clean power source. The Coalition is funding 8 hydrogen hubs around the country, each one a new campaign opportunity.
What we're aiming to build here is a globally competitive clean hydrogen industry.
The focus on cost of living pressures will only get more intense from here. The Reserve Bank is meeting on Tuesday and there are high expectations it will lift the official cash rate for the first time in more than a decade, putting extra pressure on household budgets and on politicians seeking the mantle of superior economic management. Halfway through the campaign, but still weeks from the finish line. There are plenty more stunts and site visits to come.
Whoa. It's going to be a good day.
Some stiff drinks may be required. Melissa Clark, ABC News, Canberra.
Anthony Albanese has touched down in Perth ahead of Labor's official campaign launch that he'll use to restart his bid for election after a week in isolation. Labor's taken a highly unconventional approach by picking Perth for the big event, but it shows the party sees an opportunity to end the Liberals' decades-long federal dominance in the West. Here's political reporter Jane Norman.
Fortunes of the mining boom lured Taylor Moore to the West, setting him up with the savings to set up his own cafe that's been largely unaffected by the pandemic.
Life over here has been really normal. And so it's been hard to sort of relate with anything else that's going on around Australia or around the world.
Life is a little less normal now. Omicron's arrived, and in Perth's outer suburbs, there's only one thing on voters' minds.
COVID. When's COVID going to end?
Just like Taylor Moore, Labor's hoping WA delivers, targeting Swan and Pearce, held by retiring Liberal MPs, as well as Hasluck. Winning all 3 would be a big ask. Labor failed to gain a single seat here in 2019.
What's different this time around?
I think it is that the electorate knows Scott Morrison and they don't like him.
The Prime Minister's brand was battered by his decision to back Clive Palmer's bid to tear down the state's hard border. So bruised by it, at this election, the Liberals aren't directing any preferences to Palmer's party in WA.
He's the one who challenged Western Australia's border controls that saved countless lives and saved our economy.
Federally, WA has long been a Liberal stronghold. 10 of the 15 seats are blue. But at a state level, the party was decimated at last year's election.
Here we go.
In a Labor landslide led by a wildly popular Premier.
West Australians aren't mugs. They know who runs defence and the economy, and they know that that's the Morrison government.
WA is the largest state, the powerhouse of the nation's economy, but with just 15 of 151 seats, it rarely decides who wins the federal election. In fact, the result is often known by the time the sun sets over here on polling night. So for Labor to launch its campaign in Perth for the first time in more than 80 years, it shows the party spies rare opportunity in the resource state. Jane Norman, ABC News, Perth.
The ACT Supreme Court has dismissed an application from the man accused of raping Brittany Higgins inside Parliament House for a permanent stay on charges against him. Bruce Lehrmann was charged last year after Ms Higgins complained to police. Prosecutors had been gearing up for a trial in June, but Mr Lehrmann's lawyers told the ACT Supreme Court he wouldn't get a fair trial because it would be impossible to find an impartial jury given the publicity. The ACT's Chief Justice Lucy McCallum has dismissed his application, clearing the way for a trial. Across Australia, the rising cost of living is pushing some families to the edge. After the rent and bills are paid, experts say increasingly it's food that people are going without, many of them turning to charities to provide it.
Annette Formosa never thought she'd be relying on others to put food on the table. Now, though, she can't see any other way.
We'll starve. There'll be no food.
The Western Sydney mother hasn't always needed the help of her local community.
It's so expensive. Like, before you can buy the 2-minute steaks, they used to be $5 a tray, 10. Now it's $10. And it's just like, sometimes when you've got $50 to do the week's shopping, that $10, you just can't do it.
Last year, 1 in 6 Australian adults struggled getting enough food to eat. And now inflation is the highest it's been in 2 decades. Community services in the outer suburbs have seen an increased demand for food hampers, which has now become an essential part of their service.
So many people, with all the rising costs of living, so many people just need that little bit of extra help to get through the weeks.
What fresh stuff are we giving out today?
Experts say when times get tough,
We got some cauliflower, potatoes.
and things like rent and petrol have to be paid for, food is the first to go. Thank you. In Melbourne's northwest, this community centre feeds 300 families a week.
We're certainly noticing people that are trying to get help, vouchers, food, where they haven't had to before.
Here's your bag, yeah.
Imad Abughud has been coming weekly for the last few months. It all went downhill when his car broke down and he lost his job. He's feeling the pinch, and it might even decide which political leader gets his vote.
If they help me, I'll help him. We are Australia. Yeah. If they don't help me for living, for food, why election for him?
They talk the talk, but they don't know what it's like not to be able to give your child something they want. Like spend a day how we live. They couldn't.
She hasn't heard anything yet that will decide her vote. Ahmed Yusuf, ABC News.
A Port Hedland woman has thanked rescue teams and volunteers after surviving a snake bite at the bottom of a gorge at Karanjini in WA's remote northwest. Megan Brower was hiking in Knox Gorge with her husband and 5-year-old son last weekend when she was bitten by a highly venomous brown snake. An off-duty doctor with a compression bandage and a satellite phone raised the alarm. Police, SES, Rangers and St John ambulance volunteers used a stretcher to float Ms Brower through pools of ice-cold water before hauling her up a vertical rock face.
There's a lot of loose rock. It's quite a narrow path, and I just couldn't really fathom in my mind how they were going to get a stretcher up there, but they did. It was very, very well organised and an amazing effort.
The 36-year-old says she'll keep hiking, but remember to carry a snake bite kit. Huge waves and big crowds greeted the men's draw of the Margaret River Pro, with Australians performing well in difficult conditions. Despite surging COVID cases in WA's southwest, there was a strong turnout of supporters, and they witnessed a fisheries boat almost fall victim to the big swell. Australians Callum Robson, Ethan Ewing and Jackson Baker tamed the waves to win their heats, but the ride of the day belonged to Hawaiian John Florence. Veteran Kelly Slater will need to navigate the elimination rounds after finishing last in his heat. In the NRL, it didn't come easy, but Penrith remain undefeated after an 18-4 win over the Titans. Gold Coast had an unlikely lead at the main break before Nathan Cleary rallied the Panthers. In Gosford, Carl Lawton was sent off early for a dangerous tackle, putting Manly on the back foot, with the Bunnies running away with a 40-22 win. And switching codes, West Coast is back in the woodshed, slowly carving another wooden spoon for the club. They were thumped by the Tigers in Perth. Fremantle midfielder Darcy Tucker says he has never considered leaving the club despite a difficult start to his career at the Dockers. Tucker will play his 100th AFL game when Fremantle faces Geelong at Cardinia Park on Saturday. He joined the Dockers in 2015 at the start of a long rebuild and says he wants to see success at the club.
I know it's been a tough 6 or so years since I've been at the club in terms of the success, but yeah, I feel like the group we've got right now is really special and capable of achieving some great things.
Dockers forward Lockie Schultz will also celebrate a milestone in Geelong, running out for his 50th game. Taking a look around the country tomorrow, a shower or two for Brisbane and Hobart, rain for Sydney, rain at times in Canberra, rain easing early in Melbourne, partly cloudy in Adelaide, sunny for Perth and mostly sunny in Darwin. And that's ABC Late News. I'm Brianna Shepherd. It's been a pleasure having your company. Good night.
Hello and welcome to The Virus. I'm Jeremy Fernandez. Federal and state governments have spent billions of dollars on COVID-related health and economic measures. So where has it all gone? How much more will we need in this crisis? Coming up, we'll take a look at what's needed as we move into the next phase of the pandemic. But first, let's bring in Casey Briggs. Casey, more restrictions have eased in parts of the country this week. What's happening with the number of people being infected?
Yeah, hi Jess. I think as we've been talking about for a couple of weeks now, we're looking at this second Omicron wave in Australia has, clearly sort of peaked now, but the descent is very slow. We're still seeing more than 40,000 cases a day as our sort of average at the moment and declining very slowly. If you look across the states and territories to get a bit of a view of how much virus there seems to be in different places, well, it looks like Western Australia has the most virus about at the moment. It's at least reporting the most cases per capita of all the states and territories, and the fewest cases at the moment being found in Queensland. WA sort of was improving, and that kind of improvement in its case curve has really slowed down in the last couple of weeks. That's why it's in that position. And then when we look in terms of the numbers of people dying, well, we've got some not great news really there in Australia, because since last week we've seen that grow from about 28 deaths a day on average to just under 36 deaths a day is what we're looking at the moment. So that's a pretty significant lift in just 1 week. And Jeremy, there's just probably two things I just want to draw your attention to when it comes to the deaths in Australia. One of them is how many are occurring at the moment in aged care. This chart shows you the weekly deaths reported among residents of aged care dating back to midway through last year. That's obviously the big Omicron wave at the start of this year. What we're seeing at the moment is it does look like those numbers are increasing again in aged care. 72 deaths were reported in the week ending the 21st of April. That's about, well, it's a bit over a third of all of Australia's deaths in that same period. So a third of all of Australia's deaths look like they're happening at the moment in aged care. And just another thing on deaths in general, as we're watching them climb, they are, worldwide relatively low numbers, but, one of the countries we've looked at a lot through the last couple of years as doing a not particularly good job, having very high numbers of deaths, is the United States. And they've just recently been seeing those numbers really starting to fall in terms of deaths quite dramatically. And believe it or not, Jeremy, Australia at the moment for about a week now has actually been recording more deaths a day per capita than the United States. So that kind of puts into context just how much of an improvement the United States has had. I think, you can't forget that with this blue line for Australia has been well below the US line for the entire pandemic until this week. Believe it or not, that's the situation we're in right now.
Casey Briggs, thank you. So Joe Biden's chief medical advisor, Dr. Anthony Fauci, issued a warning this week that the pandemic is not over. Instead, we're experiencing different phases of it. So what are the impacts on our health system in those various stages? Dr. Chris Moy is the Vice President of the Australian Medical Association, and he joins us now. Dr. Moy, thanks for joining us. We're clearly in a different phase of the pandemic. We seem to have settled into a more controlled environment. Have we learned enough to now say that those days of the explosive case numbers are now over for good?
Look, although we'd like to think that it's all over, I don't think COVID really is going anywhere. And despite the fact that the vaccines have done an amazing job to avert sort of the potential scenes of disaster like we had in Italy, where we had mass deaths and we had, overloaded hospitals, we are not seeing a thing called herd immunity, which we had hoped. We are still seeing significant reinfection, and we are still seeing a situation where we have the threat of new variants coming in being more infectious. And so I think the thing to keep in mind is we're not talking about a cold. We are still talking about a multi-system disorder, which is still going to cause a major threat, particularly with those who are immunosuppressed or who are unvaccinated, but also leave a lasting and ongoing legacy of long COVID. So we're seeing somewhere between 3 and 12% with long COVID, which also has another little aspect to it of potential increases of things like strokes and heart attacks and potential, brain effects like earlier dementia because of what we're seeing, the effects on the brain. So these are things that are going to continue on and be additive to what we already have in terms of a health system that is really already overstretched, needing to provide care for.
So this is an interesting thing during this election campaign, because we've returned to this debate in this election campaign about notions of debt and deficit and who is best placed to manage the economy. Is health spending going to remain as high as it has been, given all those factors that you just listed, given that we're now out of the emergency phase of the pandemic?
What we spent the money on is on COVID and managing the pandemic, not on the sort of structural issues in terms of making sure we have a health system that is actually able to manage. And we already knew that we've had an overstretched health system, both in terms of hospital and the community or private and primary health care system. Now, we've got this problem now because now we're facing a situation which, as I said, we're going to have to face with ongoing COVID threat. We're going to be facing this long COVID, and we're also having to catch up on the debt, which is really the fact that we've got surgery which has been delayed, and also care which has been delayed, and diagnoses which have been delayed. So people are really, getting later diagnosis and requiring more significant treatment because things are being held off. Now, this is a real problem, and I think the thing that the AMA would like to point out is that we really need to recognise this, and neither party recognise this. And look, if we had a bushfire and we were left with this legacy and with so many people left in a fair bit of trouble in terms of the health and left behind, and also with this ongoing threat, we'd be applying a sort of a post-disaster recovery type mentality. And that is what we need to have at this moment in time. Understand that it's no point us having got through so many people through COVID only to have them continue to suffer or potentially die early because the health system is unable to manage these extra new layers that are going to be required to care for the new burdens caused by ongoing COVID, long COVID, delayed care, and also continuing to provide health services on an ongoing basis for everything else.
Are doctors like you hearing what you'd like to hear from the campaign trail about those plans for future spending and strategies to manage COVID in the community?
Not at all, I'm afraid, and we've heard basically nothing from the government, unfortunately. They throw out large numbers, but they're essentially recurrent spending or spending they spent on COVID to, do the things we need to buy vaccines and do the testing. I mean, that's what that was spent on. That was not on the ongoing health needs of the community and the new layers of care that are going to be required. So we really do need, number one, a post-disaster recovery mentality in terms of catching up on things like elective surgery. And the Victorian government have, to their credit, focused on that. Areas like looking at delayed care, looking at long COVID, but also just really bulking up both the hospital system and the primary health system for ongoing needs to be able to look after COVID in the long term. Because I think at the moment, as we've kind of said, we're almost at a stalemate at the moment. We could even get worse at some stage with COVID. We need to understand this will be on top of the healthcare needs that we've had to provide for everything else.
Dr. Chris Moy, thank you.
It's a pleasure.
So it's pretty clear the government's fiscal strategy has had to change considerably because of the pandemic, and the nation's finances don't sit where many had expected just a couple of years ago. Peter Martin is the business and economy editor of The Conversation and a visiting fellow at the Crawford School of Public Policy. He joins us now. Peter Martin, thanks for joining us. This whole pandemic has led to a bit of an economic experiment. How worried should we be about the state of national debt and budget deficit right now?
Not at all, Jeremy, because the alternative would have been worse. The same as during the global financial crisis, when during the election, the coalition's reminding us that Labor ran up lots of debt. Nowhere near as much, of course, but then the crisis wasn't nearly as bad. That meant that Australia was, well, about the only country in the developed world to avoid what is called in the rest of the developed world the Great Recession. We here call it the GFC, or the global financial crisis. That's because the government borrowed big to spend on cash payments to households, in its case, to spend on building school halls. Here the government has borrowed much bigger crisis, but same advice, acting on the same advice, and it has saved, well, thousands of deaths. In most countries in the world, in the first year of the COVID crisis, deaths went up, and deaths went up more than COVID. In other words, there were deaths caused by people not being able to get to hospital and not being able to get a place for other conditions. Here in Australia, deaths went down, including the 800 or so people who died of COVID in the first year. That's because we adopted masks early. It's because we locked down, and we, as a result, had a mild flu season. So the benefit to Australia, and of course we kept Australians in jobs through JobKeeper, an idea we borrowed from New Zealand, that we kept them tied to their employer. It cost a lot of money, but the alternative would have been worse.
And yet we keep hearing from the election campaign trail that there is now this need to rein in spending now that the emergency phase of the pandemic is over, that the state of national debt poses a risk to future generations, our future capacity to deal with other issues that may arise. What do you think of that when you hear that from all the major parties?
It's not literally true. You know, people say, think about the children, or think about your grandchildren. How are they going to have to pay off the debt? A few points to make. One, debt doesn't need to be paid off, ever. The government is more like a corporation than it is an individual. An individual who borrows needs to pay, or when they die, it needs to be paid out of their estate. A company, BHP, lives forever. So does the government. It borrows, repays. Australian government loans are being repaid all the time. No problem there. They're just borrowing more money to substitute. There's no end date. So there's that. As for the cost of the repayments, our children and our grandchildren will be, according to the intergenerational report, in 40 years' time, 70% better off, 70% higher GDP per person. Now, if that's the case, how can I put this? Could they afford an extra 2% of their much higher income in tax? Of course they could. And there's something else specific to this bout of spending. It wasn't the case in the GFC. The spending was financed by government borrowing. They issue bonds, which is a piece of paper basically in return for money. Those bonds, those pieces of paper were bought by the Reserve Bank. Of the extra bonds issued during the global pandemic, around 60% of them, depends on the line of bonds, depends on how many years, are actually owned by the Reserve Bank. This means, yeah, sure, the government's got to pay more interest. Doesn't at the moment. Interest is no higher than it was because interest rates have been low. In due course, it'll have to pay more interest because it's borrowed more. Who will it pay it to? The Reserve Bank. What will the Reserve Bank do with it? do with, say, half of it, it'll hand it to the government in higher dividends. It's a wonderfully circular thing. Usually you can't do this because usually your currency might tank. But given that every other currency, every other country, the US, Europe, so on, has been doing this, there's no currency for us to depreciate against. They're all doing it. So, unless we judge ourselves by the standards of another planet and say we'd depreciate against somewhere else that hadn't been doing this, we have no problem.
We've just been hearing from the AMA about the need to not take the foot off the pedal when it comes to health spending, with all these other health issues kind of coming down the line as we start to get back to some semblance of normality. Where do you see health spending going in the next few years?
Going up, and that's because we want it to. The Australian National University that I'm part of runs a pre-election survey. Every election, they've been doing it for about more than 20 years. And it used to be that you asked people what are the most important issues to them, and number one was tax. They wanted lower taxes. Health spending was quite low. Now, sometime in the 2000s, that changed. The two lines crossed, and now health spending is the number one thing that people want. They don't want less of it, they want more of it. That's because the population is older, more concerned about that, and also the population is richer. And when you get richer, you feel less need to have your tax cut, and you move on from primary needs, getting fed, housing and so on, to secondary needs, which are education for your children and being looked after. The one thing really that private money can't buy.
Peter, thank you so much for your time on the program. Really appreciate it. And that is the show for this week. Thanks for your company. From all of us, bye for now.
Hello, I'm Stan Grant. How wonderful it is to be back here at Brisbane Powerhouse. Thank you for that really nice welcome. This is now Australia's fastest growing city, Brisbane. It's great to have some of you from surrounding areas as well. Some have travelled from Ipswich to join us here tonight, and we're glad that you did. Joining me on the panel, Labor member for Lilly, Annika Wells, who holds one of the most marginal seats in the country. Minister for Employment and Acting Education Minister, Stuart Robert. Director of the Griffith Asia Institute, Caitlin Byrne. Former Queensland Premier and Liberal Democrats Senate candidate Campbell Newman, and Greens Senator for Queensland Larissa Waters. Please welcome everyone. Great to have you all here.
I'm 20 years old. I work a minimum wage job and I study full time. I live in a constant state that I won't be able to afford fuel in my car or be able to put groceries or ever get a house. Not only this, but there's talk of war, there's talk of running out of fuel, and there's also still living through COVID. Is there any point that I keep studying, that I keep trying, that I keep wanting these aspirations, or shall I just get comfortable in bed? So Australia used to be a place that I was very happy to say I was a part of, and I saw many ambitions here. Should I just get comfortable in this paycheck to paycheck sort of lifestyle, or should I keep going? Thank you.
Keep going, Jade. Keep going. I'm sorry to hear that things look so bleak, but it is understandable, Annika. What do you offer to someone like Jade when you hear that?
It is so bloody hard to be a young person in Australia at the moment. Rent in Brisbane averages about $500 a week now. You probably know that. If you need to get to Headspace, it's 4 months wait. At Nunda, 4 out of 10 young people have never had a permanent full-time job because those jobs keep getting casualised. And I got elected in 2019. It's my first term. What staggers me is that 2019 was the first year that there were more Australians born after 1980 than before, and it was the first year that our workforce had more millennials and Zoomers in it than all of the other generations combined. But we are only 10% of the national parliament. I'm the youngest woman in the House of Reps this term, and I am 36, married, I have 3 kids and a rescue kelpie. You know, I'm at an age now where I'm starting to get really excited by orthopaedic footwear. The state of young people and their representation in our parliament is
dire. So please do not get comfortable, get elected, or find one of your peers who you think would be great to represent you and your voice and your people in Parliament, and get them to Canberra as soon as possible.
Yeah, Stuart, Robert, of course, what happens here now, though, is that we're hearing from Jade about just daily getting by, and we're now likely during this election campaign to see an interest rate rise, inflation going up around the world and going up here. Sadly, things are not going to get much better, are they?
Well, thanks, Jade, first of all, for your honesty. It can be difficult coming forward and saying it's hard, and it is. And every generation has its certain struggles, and we've seen coming out of COVID some of the challenges in mental health, especially as the acting education minister and visiting a school this morning in Petrie, just talking to students and parents about programs they're running to help young Australians really adapt and try and overcome some of the great challenges they've had. So it's a very honest response. It's a very common response from young people in that respect as well. I've got 3 sons, and I know Annika's got a young family. I've got a 16-year-old, 14-year-old, 12-year-old who constantly tell me they're stressed as well. But at the same time, to join Annika, Australia remains a land of enormous opportunity. Yes, there are some great uncertainties, and I think they're going to continue for a long time forward, as there have been uncertainties in the past. But with that comes enormous opportunity. With unemployment at 4% and getting lower, the opportunity for a job is always there, with opportunities in terms of education, for study and for travel. In pre-pandemic, over 11 million Australians travelled. So the opportunities are there. It's just about really embracing them, studying hard, looking for them, and seeking support and help if it's needed.
I'm not going to speak for Jade, but I don't know if that's the answer you were looking for, Jade, when you said that I can't afford my rent, fuel, groceries. There's talk of war, running out of fuel, COVID, prices going up. We've asked both of you, and you've told her exactly all the things that Jade knows and a pep talk about how to hang in there. But what are you actually going to do, Annika? What is the answer to what Jade is saying here? She's saying she can't afford fuel and rent and groceries. She doesn't need a pep talk.
No, and I wasn't giving you a pep talk. I was urging you to run for Parliament. I hope you do it. But I accept your point. You're talking about cost of living and a sense that people aren't looking after you, people aren't addressing these concerns that bother you day to day. And I want to say, I get it. Like, I've got 3 kids. We pay childcare fees for 3 of them. The cost of everything is going up and wages aren't. What is Labor going to do? We're going to fix wages. We have to lift wages, and we have to give people good, secure jobs, because if you can take away the worry about living day to day, what your hours look like week to week, what your paycheck's going to do, and whether you're going to stay in that job beyond the contract that you might be in, then you can start to worry about getting your life together and doing things that you want to do, planning ahead.
Stuart, Robert, again, the question to you was that on your watch, your government's watch, inflation's going up, and we're on the verge of having an interest rate rise. And of course, we've heard, Jade said here, about the price of rent in Brisbane going up as well. So beyond platitudes, what are you actually going to do? What can you offer someone like that?
And I'm happy to go through what government does. I wanted to show some empathy first, because I do understand the significant challenges. It's why tax cuts are so central, to ensure that you get more money and keep more of it. It's why, in terms of coming forward to 1 July 2024, we bring forward the next round of tax cuts that knocks out an entire tax bracket. It's why the automatic stabilisers are there in terms of rent assistance for you, in terms of off-study there, as well as a range of other payments depending upon your family circumstances. I don't know if you have a partner or children. It's why the budget includes cost of living adjustment packages, especially in terms of the low income and low and middle income tax offsets. So these cost of living adjustments, these supports in terms of what's called the automatic stabilisers, either through off-study, through youth allowance, depending upon whether you're studying full-time or otherwise, the tax cut structures we're putting in place are all designed to provide as much assistance to you as possible. It's also why we're doubling down in terms of skilling. There has never been as much support going into skilling now, because we know if we can raise the skills of Australians, it leads to higher paying jobs. And I'd certainly encourage you to embrace that skilling agenda.
Larissa Waters.
Yeah, look, this is from a government that made university more expensive, when in fact it used to be free and should be free again. So Thank you, Jade, for encapsulating what so many other people feel right now. It's getting really hard to get by, and you're not alone in that regard. Everything's going up except your wages. But you know what else went up? The wealth of billionaires during COVID. Mining billionaires in particular doubled their wealth. So we've actually got a growing gap between the very wealthy and ordinary people. And this government isn't doing anything to fix that. What they could and should be doing is making TAFE and uni free. They should be putting dental and mental health care into Medicare, because no one can afford to go to the dentist and no one can afford to pay for the mental health treatment that they need. And here's a suggestion. You mentioned Austudy. It's too low. And so are all of the other social support payments. They are below the poverty line, and they should be at least $88 a day. Can I just finish, stand on that point? We can have all of these things. We can have a government that works for you and not just big corporates and political donors if we make the billionaires and the big corporations pay their fair share of tax. We can raise the revenue and then fund the services that people need to address that cost of living.
All of that sounds good, Larissa Waters. It'll get applause, but debt's going up. We've had to reach into government revenue to get us through the other side of COVID. Inflation is global. Interest rates are going up around the world. What you're suggesting here is more spending, finding the money for more spending when debt is already going higher.
Well, how about we get rid of the $184 billion of stage 3 tax cuts that will go to the incredibly wealthy that do not need the help? Redeploy that money into those things that I just mentioned.
Campbell Newman, I was struck by something that you said, and it led to your disaffection with Liberal Party, and that is that you look at Australia and you don't recognise the country anymore. What do you mean by that?
Well, I don't recognise Australia, and I guess I'm agreeing with the concerns you're expressing, because this country has lost its mojo. And I grew up as a teenager in a country that believed in national development. It was the generation of World War II who built this country, who built the highway system, alumina refineries, coal-fired power stations, dams and irrigation schemes, and there was opportunity. But I think we've forgotten where our bread's buttered, how we earn our place in the world. And I'm sorry, Senator, I don't think the prescription to deal with the issue here is more tax. I don't think it's more spending. It's actually about cutting taxes. It's about creating an environment where people can take control of their money. For example, voluntary superannuation, being able to opt out rather than letting expensive and high-priced fund managers clip the ticket on your money.
One moment, please.
And it's about creating a country and a system where individual enterprise is rewarded and people can get ahead, because that's the way we actually deal properly with the sort of problems that have been expressed. And inflation is high, Minister, not just because of international pressures, it's because of the spending that's continued post-pandemic. It's because the RBA should have moved some months ago to deal with interest rates, and sadly, and I've been through this, I'm 59 this year, and I saw what happened when the RBA didn't move many years ago, 30 years ago, didn't move quickly enough, and it made it harder and tougher for Australians eventually with the recession we'd had to have, and I don't want that for a minute. What I want is for you to have Australia out there in front of you as a land of opportunity where you can get the rewards for your labour, and that's what the Liberal Democrats are all about.
Can I jump in?
Please.
And I think it's just fantastic, Jade, that you've really kicked tonight's discussion off, and fabulous to be here at this iconic cultural institution, the powerhouse of Brisbane, one of many, can I say. But young people are going to be the future, taking us forward. And the issues you're talking about are not abstract. And I think sometimes, particularly when we're in campaign mode, and I'm the non-politician here on the panel, so it's easy for me to talk a little bit about this, but the issues you're talking about are the issues people are talking about around the dinner table.
Too right.
And they are hard. And not only is it hard to navigate the rental assistance landscape, it's hard to just find the form you have to fill out. It's hard to talk to a person to actually understand how that fits with other social welfare provisions, with your education. And you don't actually have all that many hours in the day when you're also working and you're studying. And I think we need greater recognition, particularly in this campaign. There are a few weeks left to have more young people talking about the real issues they are facing, because you are the ones who are going to be taking forward the challenges, addressing the challenges that we'll be here talking about tonight, but we're going to be looking to you. We need to invest in you. So I would just say there's an opportunity for all the politicians here to really take the concerns you've put on the table very seriously over the next couple of weeks and give you some solutions.
Jade, thank you so much. A fantastic question. Thank you so much.
It is concerning for me to see an important and potentially volatile relationship with China being hauled around for election time chess beating. If we were to experience conflict with China, we would surely need the support of our allies, namely America. However, last year, we saw Joe Biden extraordinarily forget the name of our own leader during a defence announcement. Does Australia need a reality check when it comes to our own sense of importance on the world stage? And are we drawing a target on our backs with the expectations of assistance from an ally who will not remember our names in the morning?
Caitlin.
Thank you. That's a really good question, Georgia. And one of the things I would say about this particular election campaign as well is that I've been really pleased to see foreign policy get more of a run, actually generate more of a debate.
But are you pleased with the debate?
But exactly. And we do risk the issue of politicising some issues that are going to be incredibly important for us over the next decade. And, you know, we are seeing an incredible shift in our strategic environment. That is not at question. China's rise, but the rise of others, is really changing the landscape. I think Australians do need to have more of a conversation about the relationship we have with the United States. It is a long-standing relationship. It has been a pillar of our foreign policy, but obviously the years under Trump, you know, really shook some of the foundations of that. We may have to step up a little bit more in our own environment and not rely as much on the United States, depending on how their political environment goes forward. I mean, I think we actually do have to think much more carefully about our relationship with China, with the rest of Asia, with the Pacific, and we've got to think about multiple issues at the same time. And this is where I think our diplomatic capability needs a huge boost. It has been underfunded and under-resourced, it's hollowed out, it's stretched thin. We don't have the capability, I would suggest, to take a robust foreign policy forward and implement that in our region.
Caitlin, is it a time for diplomacy, or is it in fact a time to, as we heard from Peter Dutton, prepare for war? Diplomacy is one thing, but is Xi Jinping in a diplomatic mind? Is Vladimir Putin in a diplomatic mind?
I mean, it's a really challenging environment we're in, there's no question, and we do have to use all the levers of statecraft that we have at our disposal. Defence is a really important part of that. I would question why we're talking about war in a national campaign. I think the rhetoric is very much shaped...
Xi Jinping is talking about war, isn't he? Directly, when he threatens to take back Taiwan by force.
He's certainly using much more aggressive language than we've seen in the past. That's absolutely right. And we have to be very prepared for a changing environment in which China is exerting more influence, more aggressively. But I would suggest that the language we've heard recently about preparing for war hasn't necessarily been helpful for Australia's reputation. It has had more of a domestic tinge. It's very much about demonstrating strength and a track record on defence. Don't get me wrong, though. I do think we need to invest in our defence capability more than we ever have before. We've got to shift our capability as well. We've got to do that while we also think about our diplomacy and our development assistance.
Campbell Newman, you served in the military. How do you see this moment right now where we've had a war in Ukraine, increasing talk of conflict out of China, a deep freeze in relations between China and the United States, talk of a new Cold China and Australia as well, and talk of a new Cold War. How do you see this moment playing out?
Look, I've been disturbed about the language from Minister Dutton in the last few days, I've got to say. Having said that, it's probably just my feeling he's gone a bit too far. he's right to actually point out that this is a very worrying time, and the most worrying time since the 1930s. But it's not all bad. I think what's happened in the Ukraine has been a very sobering lesson already to China in terms of the way the West has reacted. If you go back to the 1930s, certain dictators at the time misjudged the democracies. They felt the democracies were weak and divided and wouldn't stand up and wouldn't fight. But ultimately, that was proved wrong. And I think perhaps Mr. Putin is seeing the same thing, that it's taken a while and the people of the Ukraine have suffered terribly, but that coalition of support against the Russians has built, it has grown, and there's a determination now that perhaps I would have been surprised only a few months ago. And I think if we now turn to China, they're far more exposed. Putin holds some amazing levers in terms of the energy resources that he can withhold from Western Europe, whereas China needs to sell us products.
We
need to sell the West products.
It
needs to buy
we need China, don't we? It's
exactly.
the biggest engine of economic growth.
It's a symbiotic relationship. So I guess where I land this is that there are some bright spots like that. I think it's going to make the Chinese Communist Party sit up and take notice. But I think what we need to do now, going back to what Caitlin was saying, is we need to get a defence force set up and operating in a way that's far more about self-reliance. Now, Peter Dutton's made some great announcements, but my final point is, and this is one of the things that disappoints me, 9 years of coalition government, no subs, no missiles, no frigates that have got the right capability, patrol boats that don't work properly as well. You could go on and on and on. Well, time's up.
I want to get a response from Stuart Robb in a minute, but Larissa Waters, I'll go to you. At a time when we've heard that we need to increase our military spending. The Greens want to reduce military spending to 1.5% of GDP and renegotiate the alliance with the United States. Why would you be renegotiating the alliance with the United States at a time when China is threatening war with Taiwan, signing security pacts with the Solomon Islands, and how is that a time to reduce military spending?
Well, I think Georgia phrased it beautifully when she pointed out that the President couldn't even remember our Prime Minister's name. It is long past time that Australia had an independent.
I think he knew. I think he may have known his name. But the question is, how do we renegotiate that at a time when increasing tensions, when we should be looking to the United States, shouldn't we, as a bedrock of security in the region?
We need an independent foreign policy that puts Australia's best interests. And we are an important player in our region, and I think we have ignored our regional responsibilities for far too long. It's probably why we've seen the Solomons enter into a pact with China, because we've cut foreign aid, we've done nothing about the climate crisis that Pacific leaders have been begging us to lead on and do better on. And we also cut the Australian network, that soft diplomacy of broadcasting and reciprocal. So it's kind of no surprise that we're now in the situation that we're in. And in some ways, I agree with Campbell. It's ironic that they've spent all this money and we still don't have anything to show
let's go to Stuart Robert.
You don't solve war by having more guns. The only people that benefit from war are the arms manufacturers.
Stuart Roberts, clearly 40 years until we get the nuclear-powered submarines, according to the AUKUS deal. Have we been too slow in preparing for the war that Peter Dutton's promising?
If our response on climate change is why the Solomons have gone to China, the biggest emitter in the world, I mean, it's complete nonsense. The US relationship will remain a bedrock relationship. It's widened in terms of AUKUS, in terms of Australia, UK and the United States in America. We inherited 8 years ago defence spending at 1.56% of GDP from the Labor Party. It's a statement of fact. It's now up to 2.1%. Investments are strong. Not a single military vessel boat started under Labor. Continuous shipbuilding program now, continuous. That will go forever. Across almost 52 surface and subsurface vessels. A weapons and missile program, of course, commitments now to move into a nuclear-powered boat because of the small modular reactors allowed to do it. So substantial investments. And we're right to call out the arc of influence, that unholy arc to our north. We're right to call out China's influence and what they're seeking to do. We're right to call out their economic coercion, as they're doing in terms of our trade, not just across coal exports, but across barley, across other areas, including wine. We're right to do that. We're right to call out what's happening in the Pacific Ocean. And notwithstanding your comments, which I disagree with, ma'am, we've opened 6 new embassies in the South Pacific.
There's been a bit, but we're still at the lowest of the OECD countries.
We are 50% of all development assistance in the South Pacific. We are 2/3 of all development assistance in the Solomon Islands comes from Australia. This is not an issue of neglect. This is an issue of China playing by different rules that have zero transparency in the Pacific. That's what we're facing, and it is concerning. And we should all be concerned by this because it is going to be a challenging future in our region.
Annika, aren't there questions to be asked about Labor's consistency? When Labor was last in power, it flip-flopped on the idea of the threat from China and defence spending, going up under Kevin Rudd, coming down under Julia Gillard. We had a different approach depending on which Labor government there was. At a time when you're facing the type of challenges the world is right now, how much can Labor be relied upon?
No, I brought the receipts on this one. The government claims to have 2 great strengths, economic management and national security, and this week they've stuffed up both. To your question, Stan, what the government did, what Rudd-Gillard government did in
But it wasn't the Rudd-Gillard governments. It was Kevin Rudd who had one view and Julia Gillard who had another when it came to defence spending. And that's the question about inconsistency, isn't it?
Well, my understanding is that defence spending rose every year bar one across the 6 years. Foreign aid, which is a key element of our relationship with the Pacific, was cut by $250 million when the coalition came to power. Like Larissa was saying, soft power under Radio Australia was gutted under this government. For some remote islands in the Solomons, that is their major source of news, and it was cut by this coalition government. Climate change, I mean, these Pacific countries, 13 microstates, they talk about 3 great powers in the region. They talk about the US, they talk about China, and they talk about climate change. And this Minister of Defence was caught laughing about water lapping at their door. This government did not take their key, most existential threat seriously, and now we are suffering the consequences of it.
Stuart Robert.
Let's look at the facts. The idea that we are suffering the consequences in the Solomon Islands because of climate change, that somehow, even though we provide 2/3 of all development assistance into the Solomon Islands, 2/3, $2.8 billion right across the board in the Pacific, $160 million per annum. In fact, the Prime Minister's first visit after the last election was to the Solomons, but apparently the Solomon Islands have chosen China because of climate change. Is just a complete and utter nonsense. We're just dealing with a different approach that China has, a lack of transparency and a different focus they've got in the South Pacific. It is of great concern. It is going to be a great challenge, and we're going to have to face up to it.
Polls have consistently shown that climate change and the environment is the biggest issue facing voters here in the Brisbane electorate. A few days ago, the coalition candidate for Flynn called the commitment to net zero by 2050 a flexible plan. While Matt Canavan said, it is all over bar the shouting. Meanwhile, the party's inner city candidates continue to spruik their climate credentials. With their internal climate wars not over, how can we trust the coalition to ever take the climate change seriously?
Stuart Robert.
You can't. You can't.
Look, thanks for your question. The government's position on net zero by 2050 is absolutely clear.
That's not what Matt Canavan thought.
Well, it is. Just because 1 out of 100 in a party room has a view,
I think it's more
when
than
the
one.
Liberal government, Liberal National government, the Liberal parties come to that agreement, the National Party has come to that agreement, the leadership and the government has come to this position, and the government has come forward to the Australian people to say, this is our position. It's quite clear, and if one person has another view, well, that's fine, but the government's position is rock solid and crystal clear. And the Prime Minister's made this clear. Indeed, the candidate for Flynn has also made the point he was talking about lead up to and not making a comment upon the actual net zero by 2050. But we cannot be clearer than this. The government is absolutely committed. We're one of few countries on earth that have brought forward a sensible plan driven by technology, not taxes, to actually get there. And of course, we've updated our projections on emissions reduction to 30 to 35% by 2030. And we're one of only a few countries on earth to actually have achieved our Kyoto 1 targets of 439 million tonnes over our Kyoto target. Now, they are statements of fact, not in contention.
But when Matt Canavan says that, isn't there a case here that you're saying one thing to one constituency and another to another, and it goes to the credibility issues, doesn't it?
Like the Labor Party with the coal miners.
Matt Canavan doesn't speak for the government. The Prime Minister does.
Stan, the Labor Party have tied themselves in knots about how they address this with coal miners, people in the Hunter and in central Queensland. By the way, I'm 100% with Canavan, and I also agree with Colin Boyce. And net zero, after what's happened in the Ukraine, in terms of Western Europe, is now dead.
Can I go
the grown-ups in Western Europe know that it's energy security. That's the issue
you and
now.
I are at odds because the government, the Morrison government, cannot be clearer on our commitment to net zero by 2050.
Well, Barnaby Joyce tells people different things
on our
behind
technology
closed doors.
plan, and Barnaby Joyce, as the Deputy Prime Minister, has also been clear and unanimous on his support with the government as a core member of the government that net zero by 2050.
That's not what a gentleman told me he said in Emerald recently at dinner.
The direction we're going.
Let me bring Annika in on this.
Yeah.
Is there not a case though when you look to what's happening in Europe, you look at Boris Johnson putting their targets on hold, you look at the energy crisis facing potentially in Europe because of Russia turning off the pipes. Does this also not lead to countries like China or India who have already pushed their target dates down the line, perhaps even revising those again? Is the world not changing right now because of what we're seeing geopolitically that may affect targets like 2050?
No. And the job of good leaders is to write the story of the future that includes everybody. People like Daniel, who's a flood victim, resources workers, like who Colin's trying to represent up in Flynn. And the reason that this is a tricky issue, but it shouldn't be, is that we just have to get to our decarbonised future as quickly as possible. And there's no pathway to net zero or a decarbonised future, whatever the targets are, whatever the time, without doing more mining, which requires strong mining companies. But we have to mine different things. We have to mine copper and lithium to get our electric vehicles, millions of them that we're going to need. We're going to need to mine other things to get our solar, our met coal probably, to get solar and wind up and running. And we need to do that because it looks after resources workers and it helps our flood victims because it comes down to decent, hardworking manufacturing workers in electorate like mine who then build this technology that allows us to have our renewable future and allows us to sell and build wealth for our country overseas. That is the job of good leaders, to write a story that includes everybody, and that is why you have to vote for a party of government.
Thanks again to our panel, Annika Wells, Stuart Robert, Caitlin Byrne, Campbell Newman and Larissa Waters. Please thank them.
Well done. You made it. Thank you.
I want to thank everyone for sharing their questions tonight as well. It was fantastic to have your input, and please join us again next Thursday. What will the election campaign throw up? Both leaders now are back on the road next week. You'll have to wait and see. You can also join me on China Tonight on Monday night. Until then, thanks again for coming. Until then.
Albanese out of ISO. Power prices the main issue on the Labor leader's first day back. Claims of hypocrisy. Solomon Islands fires back at Australian criticism of its China deal. A Ukrainian refugee painting the way to a brighter future. And the NRL Grand Final set to stay at Olympic Park. Hello, Brianna Shepherd with ABC News. Power prices are another cost of living pressure being debated this election, with the cost of electricity soaring in recent months. Returning to the campaign trail after recovering from COVID, Labor leader Anthony Albanese is spruiking his party's plan to build more transmission infrastructure, while the coalition is focused on hydrogen power. Here's political reporter Melissa Clark.
Out of COVID ISO and back on the campaign trail.
I certainly feel much better today than I did yesterday.
The hip pocket remains the focus on the hustings.
We know that the cost of everything is going up, but people's wages just aren't.
The external influences on the economy
are going to continue.
Electricity is among the household bills getting bigger. Wholesale power prices have risen 67% in 3 months and 141% compared to the same time last year. The price hikes are greatest in Queensland and New South Wales because of surging international demand for black coal, damage to the Callide B coal-fired power station and constraints in the electricity grid. It's those constraints in transmission that Labor is focused on, promising $20 billion of upgrades to the grid to help integrate more renewables.
If we get this right, if we fix the grid, we will see those energy prices drop by $275 by 2025.
Yeah, OK.
The Coalition argues many of those upgrades are unnecessary and what's needed is more firming power to back up renewables.
That's why we have invested in Snowy 2.0. That's why we're doing Battery of the Nation. That's why we've invested in gas-fired power in Kurri Kurri.
For industry, hydrogen has the potential to be a clean power source. The Coalition is funding 8 hydrogen hubs around the country, each one a new campaign opportunity.
What we're aiming to build here is a globally competitive, clean hydrogen industry.
The focus on cost of living pressures will only get more intense from here. The Reserve Bank is meeting on Tuesday and there are high expectations it will lift the official cash rate for the first time in more than a decade, putting extra pressure on household budgets and on politicians seeking the mantle of superior economic management. Halfway through the campaign, but still weeks from the finish line. There are plenty more stunts and site visits to come.
Whoa. Gonna be a good day.
Some stiff drinks may be required. Melissa Clark, ABC News, Canberra.
Solomon Islands Prime Minister has delivered a withering verbal assault on Australia, mocking the federal government's complaints about his country's security deal with China. Scott Morrison has dismissed the criticism, but the extraordinary remarks highlight how the relationship between Honiara and Canberra is starting to disintegrate. Here's Foreign Affairs correspondent Stephen Jedgetts.
A furious Prime Minister lashes out.
What is needed, Mr. Speaker, is an acknowledgement of a serious blunder.
Australia's accused China and Solomon Islands of negotiating their security pact in secret. Now Manasseh Sogavare has hit back, finding a new target.
Today we join our nations in a next-generation partnership.
Taking aim at the nuclear submarine pact negotiated in secret by Australia and accusing Canberra of hypocrisy.
I learned of the AUKUS Treaty in the media, Mr. Speaker. One would expect that as a member of the Pacific family, Solomon Islands or members of the Pacific should have been consulted.
Concern about the China pact isn't subsiding in the West.
I was concerned with the report about the Solomon Islands entering into a military agreement with China. That is alarming.
Now Australian attitudes are hardening, and today Mr Morrison was blunt when asked if Mr Sogavare was echoing Chinese talking points.
Well, there's a remarkable similarity between those statements and those of the Chinese government.
The Defence Pact isn't the only agreement that Canberra is watching closely. The ABC has obtained an MOU signed in 2019 by Solomon Islands and a subsidiary of AVIC, the Chinese state-owned defence and aerospace giant. In the agreement, AVIC promises to upgrade 35 airfields in Solomon Islands if the Pacific Island country purchases 6 of its commercial aircraft. The agreement went nowhere, but it's another sign of China's strategic intent in Solomon Islands. Stephen Jedgetts, ABC News, Canberra.
Almost 3,000 people have died with the coronavirus in Victoria since the start of the pandemic. The number would have been even higher without the use of one of the most extreme forms of life support. Specialists have been using the ECMO device to treat more than 60 people.
There were no red flags at the start of Stephen Taliski's COVID diagnosis.
Maybe just a little headache and the likes.
But as the days dragged on, his symptoms became worse.
And then walking up the stairs became a little bit more of a challenge, walking to the fridge, and I was huffing and puffing. My heart rate started to go up.
1 week in, the 33-year-old was hospitalised and his condition continued to deteriorate.
Remember the nurse hitting the emergency buzzer in the room, and then all the big doctors kind of flew in.
He was moved to ICU and placed in a coma. When that support wasn't enough, he was treated through extracorporeal membrane oxygenation, or ECMO. It was 84 days before he woke up.
And then you just think, you know what, I didn't see a Christmas or a New Year, and yeah, and that was a slow process to try process all that.
Stephen is one of 64 COVID patients in Victoria who've used the machine. It does the job of the heart or lungs, buying time for recovery.
Of patients that required mechanical ventilation, so that's people will be familiar when you use a ventilator and a breathing tube. So if you look at all those patients, about 4 or 5% of them were suitable for ECMO.
Typically, ECMO is used for up to 20 days. But with coronavirus, the length of time was extended, each patient spending some time in a coma.
We had 2 patients over 100 days of support.
It is reserved for the most extreme life support, but everything carries risks versus benefit. And so you have to make a decision at that particular point in time that the risks of doing ECMO are less than the benefits.
Some of the patients are still undergoing their recovery and are not out of danger just yet, so I have to recognise that. But the rate of successfully being liberated from ECMO was 83%.
After waking up, it was another 2 months before Stephen could return home.
Other than trying to get a little bit of fresh air outside now, I'm back home, which is good. So I'll slowly start to try to transition.
For now, he'll be following doctor's orders. Sarah Jane Bell, ABC News, Melbourne. A Ukrainian artist who fled the war in his homeland last month has taken to painting his new surrounds in southwest Victoria to raise funds for the war effort. And he's doing it all with donated art supplies from Warrnambool residents who are doing whatever they can to help those suffering half a world away.
With every scrape of paint, Volodymyr Normankov pours his heart onto the canvas. The fine strokes belie the trauma he and his wife Valentina faced when they fled Ukraine amid bombing and gunfire.
Our suburb was under heavy shelling. We just slept in the basement of our house. It was pretty scary.
The pair arrived at their daughter Olena's Warrnambool home after a torrid 22-day trip with little more than the clothes on their backs.
We were very surprised by the silence because during the last few days we felt very tense, always expecting explosions.
A simple call-out for unused art supplies saw the couple inundated. Normankov's among 7 displaced Ukrainians seeking refuge in the town that's doing whatever it can to support the beleaguered country. Piece by piece, stroke by stroke, a sense of normalcy returned for Volodymyr.
We are very touched by the attention of Warrnambool's community. We're lucky to live here and lucky to be here.
Winslow wool producers Brendan and Susan Finnegan's best fleece can be found in some of Italy's biggest fashion houses. This year, they're donating the best cut and sending the money made to the war effort.
This isn't going to make a huge difference, but they need so much help. But if everyone's doing it, it's when, lots of little people doing things makes a huge difference.
Volodymyr's art set to go under the hammer at a charity auction in Warrnambool this weekend as part of a series of fundraising events run by the community, with all proceeds going straight to Ukraine. But no matter how much is raised, to those far from home, there's always a need for more.
Even this, it's not enough. It's like a drop in the ocean, but it makes me feel better to do something useful.
A healing stroke of paint for a heartbroken nation. Daniel Miles, ABC News, Warrnambool.
The NRL has been threatening to take the grand final back to Queensland, but in the end, Rugby League's showpiece looks set to stay in Sydney. The NRL boss met the New South Wales Premier and they managed to find common ground.
Sydney, Brisbane, even Melbourne. This morning, it was anyone's game.
The grand final is up for grabs.
By this afternoon, it was close to game over.
I think we're close to a deal.
The NRL boss and New South Wales Premier reaching an in-principle agreement to keep the grand final in Sydney.
We've got to put the ink to the paper first and, you know, the devil's in the detail.
That detail is expected to include multi-million-dollar makeovers for suburban stadiums like the Sea Eagles Brookvale Oval and the Dragons home ground in Kogarah.
No, it's not bribery because we had a deal, and the deal was that they would spend $800 million on stadiums.
In 2020, the state government scrapped an $800 million plan to redevelop the Olympic Stadium. That money was tied to a deal that secured grand finals in New South Wales until 2046. While the deal to redevelop the stadium here at Sydney Olympic Park may be long gone, today's agreement paves the way for it to host NRL grand finals for the next 2 decades. Some critics have questioned whether the state government should be spending more money on sporting venues following big spends on stadiums in Parramatta and Moore Park, with funds already put aside for another one in Penrith. But Panthers fans aren't complaining.
Well, Queensland wants everything, don't they? Hey? They want everything that we've got down here. They want our players.
Makes more sense to have it in Sydney. The grand final's not going anywhere.
Well, not unless the pandemic forces another last-minute shift north of the Tweed. Phoebe Bowden, ABC News, Sydney.
In the NRL, it didn't come easy, but Penrith remain undefeated after an 18-4 win over the Titans. Gold Coast had an unlikely lead at the main break before Nathan Cleary rallied the Panthers. In Gosford, Carl Lawton was sent off early for a dangerous tackle, putting Manly on the back foot, with the Bunnies running away with a 40-22 win. Switching codes, and school went back this week in Perth. Tonight it was the Tigers playing teacher, giving the Eagles a lesson in how to play footy. Huge waves and big crowds greeted the men's draw of the Margaret River Pro, with Australians performing well in difficult conditions. Despite surging COVID cases in WA's southwest, there was a strong turnout of supporters, and they witnessed a fisheries boat almost fall victim to the big swell. Australians Callum Robson, Ethan Ewing and Jackson Baker tamed the waves to win their heats, but the ride of the day belonged to Hawaiian John Florence. Veteran Kelly Slater will need to navigate the elimination rounds after finishing last in his heat. And that's ABC News. For more news at any time, head to our website at news.abc.net.au. I'm Brianna Shepp. It's been a pleasure having your company. Bye for now.
Attempting to stay on message.
Nice to meet you. Yeah. Casting for the votes of weekend warriors.
You're a generous teacher.
$20 million for fishing, boating and camping.
The Prime Minister did not hold a press conference today or take questions from journalists.
He preferred the company of a hand-picked audience of the party faithful.
Hey, here you go.
The Prime Minister was on hand at a Greek Orthodox Mass in Kogarah.
Burning the midnight oil last night, attending a traditional Easter service.
And with Anthony Albanese in COVID isolation, his deputy Richard Marles stepped up.
Done under pressure. Forced to defend himself against accusations he's a soft touch on China in the Pacific. Very good.
The security pact between China and the Solomon Islands continues to dog the Prime Minister on the campaign trail.
The Chinese government does not play by the same rules.
Moving into the Northern Territory, a hostile reception waiting for the Prime Minister. potential test, isn't it, for who should be, could be the next leader?
Oh, we don't see it that way. We want the next Prime Minister of Australia to be Anthony Albanese. We're working our butts off to make that a reality.
Hey Marion, how are you? Labor's campaign has moved to the Red Centre here in the Northern Territory.
Luna. It's actually a good way to then showcase, you know, the rest of his cabinet that a lot of people have been asking, hang on, so who's going to be doing this?
It turns into a beautiful butterfly.
Well, Lisa, we're heading to the Northern Territory, but Anthony Albanese won't be there because he's stuck in ISO in Sydney.
Yeah, highly unusual situation to unfurl in the middle of an election campaign. Labor now forced to power on without its leader.
Why do you think they didn't just elevate Deputy Richard Marles to take on that role over the next 7 days?
I think probably a number of factors are at play. That Richard Marles is not necessarily the strongest communicator on that shadow front bench, and they've decided to elevate those shadow ministers who are really good at nailing the attack lines and really good at staying on message. That's why we've seen a lot of Jim Chalmers, the shadow treasurer. We saw Jason Clare, who performed really well.
Too well?
Almost too well, one might say. But I think there are also risk factors there as well. You know, you could potentially confuse the public about who the leader is.
It's unclear what impact it might have in 4 weeks' time, but it's better now than at the pointy end of the campaign. At least that's what Labor is saying.
In terms of timing, now is the time. And of course, Scott Morrison did opt for a 6-week campaign. He did that strategically, thinking that he is the stronger campaigner and he could outrun Anthony Albanese. But in the end, having that extra week might really play to Labor's benefit as well.
We saw a proof of life video from Anthony Albanese where he was doing those interviews on the Friday, but we didn't see him for the next week. We heard him in a few radio interviews, but it put the pressure more on his front bench to be out there selling Labor's case.
Yeah, there was an absolute necessity for the Labor front bench to step up, and I think, you know, Albo being away for a week, I think that was probably a net positive, because we all discovered that Jason Clare had a natural gift for zingers.
They've got a choice here between honest Albo and smirking Scott.
We saw a bit more of Jim Chalmers, who's very good at those economic punch-through messages, and the whole team, Penny Wong, very good too. So it was, in some ways, it was a welcome thing for the Labor Party, for them to use that as an excuse to say, well, it's not just Anthony Albanese you get, it's the whole lot of them.
Some Labor MPs privately as well have been saying that this was perhaps a blessing in disguise. I also think that we've seen Anthony Albanese potentially have a chance to reset. While in isolation prior to this on the campaign, he bristled a little bit when asked successive questions by successive journalists, but we have that bizarre 30-minute interview with Ray Hadley on 9 Radio this week, and he was incredibly patient.
Well, we will have no carbon tax.
No, well, let's just make sure there'll be no carbon tax under any government I'll lead, ever.
There will be no carbon tax ever.
It was not a Malcolm Turnbull, I will not take dictation from you, Alan. He was willing to take dictation from Ray Hadley.
He was... Basically, Ray Hadley shouted at him on climate, on boats, on his front bench, said he didn't think a lot of them were very good, and Anthony Albanese very patiently and calmly took those questions. I wonder if that would have happened pre-COVID.
It hasn't gone unnoticed within Labor about where is Tanya Plibersek. Now, she's out barnstorming those marginal seats, but the national campaign is choosing not to elevate her at all. It's a curious decision when she has some of the best brand recognition and is a darling of the Labor movement.
You wonder whether she's going to be used a lot more in the last 2 weeks, because the last week in particular is going to be very, very negative from the coalition if they are still so far behind.
We also saw a recalibration from Scott Morrison. After going after Anthony Albanese for the best part of the 2 weeks leading in, he pretty much didn't talk about Anthony Albanese until the last day, when he basically said he's been a bit lazy in isolation for this last week. I was very busy.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to him rejoining the campaign. He's had a pretty quiet week. I remember when I was in ISO, I had a very busy week, attending Quad summits.
Bit of a cheap shot, really.
We suspect that is an indication of what's to come, though, that we will see more of Morrison going after Albanese now that he's out of isolation.
of a halt in hostilities on the campaign trail today as the leaders stop to mark Anzac Day.
Scott Morrison and Richard Marles laid wreaths at the Darwin Cenotaph during the dawn service, giving speeches that focused both on the past and our Anzac legacy, but also the current war in Ukraine and threats to our own region.
But our world is changing.
The only way that you can preserve peace is to prepare for war.
No point in beating your chest if you're beaten to the punch.
There was no political ceasefire with Anzac Day. Blunt instrument Peter Dutton was out there sending the rhetoric up to 1,000, comparing Russia and China to the Nazis. But what's been interesting in this week is that emboldened Labor that is very happy to go toe-to-toe with the coalition over national security, which many would have thought would have been a weaker area for Labor to be arguing about.
Yeah, who'd have thunk it that Labor wants to talk about national security, but that's the size of the strategic disaster that's happened in the Solomon Islands. What's curious to me is that even though there has been damage and the sheen's come off the coalition's boast about national security, they're still keen to talk about it. So the calculation from the coalition must be, even when we're talking about it, when there has been some damage, there still is a minor positive for them.
And they really opened the door for Labor to deliver quite a significant policy in terms of the Pacific, with more money for foreign aid, more money for the ABC, which prompted a few zingers from Scott Morrison. Q&A in Honiara. We'll see you there, Probes. But it was interesting because the coalition wanted a khaki election. They've got it, perhaps not on the terms that they were hoping for.
Mr Morrison doesn't like to listen, and he certainly doesn't like to act.
We won't be having Chinese military naval bases in our region on our doorstep.
And Maurice Payne awkwardly had to admit she hadn't been to the Solomon Islands since 2019. Now, undoubtedly, COVID has been a factor there, but when the junior minister was able to get in without a quarantine the other week, it does feed into a Labor attack that the coalition has taken its eye off the ball in this part of the world, that it was too interested in Paris and not interested enough in the Pacific.
Emmanuel Macron has won the French election and become the first president in 20 years to earn a second term.
Have you called Emmanuel Macron to congratulate him on his election win? How will you mend the relationship?
Prime President Macron, I have sent him a message of congratulations directly, and I've also ensured I've sent a formal letter to him congratulating him as well.
There we go. That's how you do it. Okay.
So we saw Scott Morrison in a French bakery.
Someone's performance appraisal. This is going to be mentioned.
Who brought that up?
Why do you mention the war?
It was a bizarre choice to position him there straight after the French president's re-election. It was very strange and curious, and the stories just wrote themselves. Yours certainly did, Rose.
Well, Macron, I mean, the temptation was there.
To quote the French president, and I know how to make a croissant, I don't think Scott Morrison had a terrible technique. I know he had a terrible technique.
What I think has been interesting in terms of Scott Morrison's language about his relationship is he keeps saying, we are rebuilding the relationship, the ing being the key word. It's not rebuilt yet. It's definitely a work in progress, and this is going to be really difficult.
It's definitely damaged. And why is our relationship with France so important? France has 1.5 million citizens living in the Indo-Pacific. They are a key nuclear power. They're going to be really critical in this coordinated pushback against Beijing. So whether he likes it or not, Emmanuel Macron for the next 5 years is going to be one of the key partners of Australia, and what it's doing is shining the light on the fact that there was this real horrible spat over submarines.
Major cracks have emerged over the coalition's climate policy.
We have committed to a pathway to 2050, okay? We have committed.
Morrison's document is a flexible plan. It leaves us wiggle room.
Yeah, well, the net zero thing is all sort of dead anyway.
Just weeks before the election, the Morrison government's trying to hose down a new internal fight about climate change, which has blown up over its net zero commitment.
That's his view. It's no surprise. He's held it for a long time. That debate has been done in the coalition.
Yeah, pull your head in, Matt.
to another day on the campaign, another manufacturing plant. And we're sensing a bit of
I wasn't actually quite sure where
theme,
we
isn't
were.
it? I think this is where they make parts for planes, I believe.
Okay, very good.
You've written a lot about climate change, but it hasn't really featured in the campaign until today. What do you make of the Prime Minister's press conference today?
Well, look, I mean, he's been trying to mop up, you know, I guess the mess that Canavan has left for him. It's an unwelcome distraction for the Prime Minister.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because the PM also always says that he's the one that got the actual deal done. He brought the coalition together. And then in the middle of the campaign, you've got this intervention. It's hardly helpful, is it?
It's not helpful, but, you know, I guess from, you know, Matt Canavan's perspective, he thinks he's saying what needs to be said to keep the coal seats in central Queensland. So he's got his own agenda at play. He's not too worried about Dave Sharma's fate in Wentworth, is he? He's much more concerned about what's happening in Queensland, and he knows the message that he wants to get through to those voters.
And it reminds me of 2019 in one way, when Labor was saying one thing in coal mining communities and another thing in more progressive seats.
Absolutely.
This is the same problem. Matt Canavan's creating the same problem this time around.
Yeah, that's right. And Morrison has been trying to sort of turn the pressure on Labor. Historically, that's been a big problem for them, particularly in Queensland. But at the moment, it's really the coalition that's struggling with those competing messages.
Australia's inflation figures have just been released. Consumer prices jumped 2.1% in the first quarter of the year.
Australians could be paying more in their mortgages within days after the biggest jump in consumer prices in 2 decades.
The annual inflation rate much higher than forecast, much higher than expected.
There's Australia, performing better than all of them when it comes to cost of living pressures.
Real wages are going backwards in this country, more substantially than they are in the US.
This is particularly significant because it's happening in the midst of an election campaign.
What Labor has is a tax, a sneaky carbon tax.
This bloke is so out of touch you'd need the Hubble telescope to find him.
Quick.
Australians are getting absolutely slaughtered by this triple whammy.
Scott Morrison had been copying it from his own side, from Labor. His dream was to get an election about national security and the economy. He's getting both of those, but like with national security, the economic debate isn't going in the direction that the coalition had hoped.
The coalition was very quick to spin those inflation figures, saying it's a result of external pressures, of volatile international pressures, and that we're doing much better than other countries. The reality is, do people care? No, they don't care if people have it harder in France. They know that their groceries are going up by about 7%, meat and fruit and veg, their fuel's gone up by about 35%. So what's happening overseas isn't really going to change voters' minds about this.
Yeah, lived experience when it comes to voters, that's what counts, and that's what the government is dealing with. How does Scott Morrison deal with this? He talks about what they've done, but what they've done is not going to alleviate all of those pressures, which helps the Labor campaign, which has at its core that everything is going up except for your wages.
And potentially next week we will see the Reserve Bank having to make a decision that the poor governor, Philip Lowe's, got a shocker on his hands that he has to deal with. If he lifts the cash rate, the coalition will hate him. We'll see what we saw with John Howard in 2007. If he doesn't, he'll be accused of political interference and not doing what's in the best interests of the economy.
Everyone in the coalition seems resigned to the fact that the Reserve Bank is going to lift rates. The question is, by how much? And also, are voters going to punish them for that?
This is the story you have been waiting to hear.
Who's up for
the best family time viewing? Ready to go anytime.
Get out there. Have a look.
Sometimes you have to do the stupid things.
You're onto something, aren't you?
Entertainment the whole family can enjoy.
Yes!
Okay, you ready?
It's always very exciting.
Cheers to us.
Stream for free. Log in to ABC iView.
Charlie Pickering is back on the campaign trail.
We've got a live audience for the first time in 2 years.
Making sense of the mayhem.
I don't like to make predictions, but if he gets long COVID, he could ride this all the way to a second term.
The Weekly, Wednesday 8:30 on ABC TV and ABC iView.
City has been in lockdown.
Hello, I'm Rachel Papazzoni. Welcome to Close of Business. Coming up on the program, harvesting the highest prices in 20 years. Inflation gallops over 5%, putting an election rate rise on the cards.
I mean, we will be short, for sure. I think you'll find that everybody's going to have to put the prices up.
And rental stress hits home. Sky-high rents and record low vacancies. Why affordable housing is increasingly out of reach.
We've seen a lot of investors leaving the market, and then when the pandemic hit, that selling by investors really was supercharged.
Also on the program, when everything old is the latest new fashion, the booming business of brands selling their own clothes twice. Economists were bracing for a big number, but the latest inflation reading smashed expectations. The cost of living surged by 5.1% over the past year, the fastest pace since the Howard government introduced the GST. And that puts the Reserve Bank under pressure to raise rates for the first time in 11 years, all in the middle of an election campaign. Steve Hall's costs are soaring, and he's contemplating when to pass some of them on to his customers.
So everything is increasing, nothing certainly decreases. Barrels have gone up from $1,200 each to $1,800 each. So everything has gone up.
Steve's paying more to keep his staff, his equipment and fuel costs are up, and ingredients and additives are also more expensive, which means each glass of wine is costing him more to make, while his customers have been paying the same price for 2 years.
I mean, we will be short, for sure. I think you'll find that everybody's going to have to put the prices up. In about a year's time, we might have to put the prices up.
In the first 3 months of the year, consumer prices rose 2.1%, taking annual inflation to 5.1%. That's the biggest jump since the GST was introduced. In the quarter, the cost of building new homes increased almost 6%. Fuel was up 11%, though that will come down next quarter thanks to the excise cut. And it's getting more expensive to eat. Vegetables, fruit and beef are all costing a lot more at the checkout.
And that really matters because if we're thinking about which type of households are more or less impacted by this kind of inflationary environment, it's typically those on a lower income. They have to spend a higher proportion of their wages or their other sources of income on those essential items.
Economist Sarah Hunter says we may be nearing the peak of inflation, but higher prices will be here for some time to come.
I think that's something that we're going to continue to see, certainly through the rest of this year. And it's only really once we get into 2023 and even beyond that we'll see, I expect inflation start to really fall back down into that 2% to 3% band.
New mum Sophie Miller is all too aware of her rising food bill.
Groceries in particular is making a huge impact. Something that might have cost, $10 last year is costing $20, and eating healthy as well is becoming even more difficult because fresh fruit and veg is so expensive.
Annual core inflation, which strips out one-off price rises, is 3.7%, well above the Reserve Bank's 2 to 3% target range. That's pushed some economists to forecast the RBA will lift the official interest rate on Tuesday. But the nation's biggest lender says whether it's next week or next month doesn't really matter.
At the end of the day, whether they move in May or June is sort of semantics as far as the impact on the economy goes. It's only 1 month. And I think based on what they've set up until this point, it makes a lot of sense for them to hold out and move in June.
Gareth Aird thinks the rate hikes will be slow and steady, reaching 1% by the end of the year.
I think they need to deliver a shallow tightening cycle. Otherwise, they'll choke off, I think, the wages growth and the strong economy that they've so long desired.
Something that can't be ignored in a cost of living election campaign.
Today's higher inflation numbers are a reminder to Australians that we are living in a complex and volatile economic environment.
Everything is going up except people's pay, and they're about to be hit with rising interest rates on top of all of that.
Sophie is worried about her mortgage repayments.
It's really scary because interest rates have been so good for such a long time. It would make a really big impact if we had to increase our mortgage payments every month. You know, that's our biggest expense by a landslide at the moment.
Rates are going up, just like the cost of living. So it's not if the Reserve Bank hikes rates, but when. AMP Capital Chief Economist Shane Oliver says capital city property values will eventually slide more than 10% when the RBA steps hard on the brakes.
We think that the Reserve Bank will raise the official cash rate by 0.4%. Starting next week. I mean, I must admit it could be 0.15%, but whatever it is, I think they'll start the process of raising rates. By the end of this year, we think the cash rate will have risen to 1.5%, and through next year, we'll probably get up to about 2%. I guess what will happen here is that as we go through the process of raising rates, the Reserve Bank will be able to slow the process down just to make sure that the household sector is not getting into excessive trouble.
Homeowners and renters, Australians all over, are facing all sorts of increasing prices. Groceries are more expensive, fuel costs are high, and now we know power bills are going to soar as well, with wholesale energy prices up 141% in the first 3 months of this year. Higher rates are going to be pretty unhelpful in that environment.
Look, they certainly are bad news for homeowners with a mortgage. There's no doubt about that, given the other costs and price increases we're seeing come through. But we do know from basic economics that if money or the availability of money is too cheap, then that can add to inflationary pressures. So it's really all about controlling inflationary expectations. The longer inflation stays higher, the harder it will be to get it back down. So what the Reserve Bank is going to try and do is to get that inflation rate down, make sure inflationary expectations don't rise too much, and therefore make sure that inflation is not locked in at these high levels.
Shane, AMP says home values will be a casualty of rate hikes. You're predicting a 10% fall by the end of next year. That's going to hurt people who have small deposits and big loans who potentially got in pretty late, right?
Look, there's no doubt this decline in property prices that we're anticipating will particularly hurt those who got in more recently. And obviously those with low deposits are at more risk of seeing a negative equity situation in their property, where the value of the property is worth less than what they owe on it. But by the same token, we have seen a massive rise in property prices over the last 18 months in some cities, up almost 30%. That's a huge increase, a big rise relative to wages growth, which have only gone up 2 or 3%. And so, again, a massive deterioration in affordability. So ultimately, we really want to see property prices come down just to improve affordability, making it a lot easier for new borrowers and first-home buyers to get into the property market. So I actually think a pullback in property prices would be quite healthy. But I don't think it's going to cause a major round of defaults, and I don't think the Reserve Bank is going to raise interest rates so much that it causes that. It really just wants to cool things down, slow down demand for property, and in the process use that to contribute to a decline in the inflation rate as the wealth impact of rising prices starts to reverse.
Do you see that pullback across the board? I'm thinking capitals like Adelaide that have been pretty immune to any downturn to date.
There's no doubt we're seeing a very diverse situation across Australia. In fact, property prices are already falling in Sydney and Melbourne, not dramatically, but they've started to come down over the last few months, and that's in response to the rise in fixed mortgage rates that we've seen over the last 12 months, and also in response to poor affordability. Now, of course, cities like Perth, Brisbane, Adelaide, they're in a somewhat stronger position because they don't have quite the affordability problem that Sydney and Melbourne have, and they don't have quite the high level of debt that those other cities have. So I think there's probably going to be a case that on average around Australia prices are going to fall 10 to 15%. Sydney and Melbourne will be at the higher end of that decline, up towards a 15% top to bottom fall out into early 2024, whereas other cities like Brisbane, Adelaide, Perth will see more modest declines. But I think all property across Australia will be affected by this, simply because when people show up at the bank to borrow some money, they're going to find that with these higher rates, they'll be able to borrow a lot less than they could of, say, 12 months ago.
You mentioned wages as well. We know, of course, the RBA is keen to see that data as well. But it's pretty clear that there's no way the national wage rise, if there is one, is anywhere near the inflation numbers we saw this week. That's just adding to cost of living pressures as well.
There is a problem here in Australia that even if wages growth accelerates to 3%, which is what the Reserve Bank has been hoping for, it won't cover the pick-up in inflation we're seeing. So that is certainly a problem. So it's a bit academic as to whether the Reserve Bank waits for those wages numbers, which are due on the 18th of May. So my feeling is the better approach by the Reserve Bank is to do all it can to get inflation back down again, to make sure inflationary expectations don't get out of control, but then by the same token, hope that the jobs market remains strong, and that's particularly a function for the government to keep the economy motoring along so the jobs market remains strong, so we get to that point that the 4% level of unemployment and a reduction in underemployment leads to stronger bargaining power on the part of workers and therefore stronger wages growth.
Shane Oliver, great to get your viewpoint. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel.
So inflation is on the march and rates are set to follow. Sue Lannon looks back at the long road to rising prices.
It's the pandemic nobody saw coming. Lockdowns and restrictions brought the global economy to a standstill. Initially, prices plunged as worried consumers stopped spending. Governments and central banks pumped trillions and trillions of dollars into their economies, slashing interest rates to record lows to stave off a predicted recession. Here, the Reserve Bank cut rates to near zero, pumping $350 billion into the economy buying government bonds. But government home building subsidies and the cheapest money on record saw prices start to turn. House prices and construction costs soared. All the stimulus and working from home boosted demand for things like furniture, computers and home entertainment. Disrupted global supply chains, especially shipping, couldn't keep up. It didn't help when one of the world's biggest container ships blocked the vital Suez Canal. Russia's invasion of Ukraine exacerbated energy prices, also hitting metals and grains. Crude oil jumped above $100 a barrel, pushing up petrol and transport costs here. And shoppers have been hit at the supermarket as devastating floods push prices for fruit and veg. All this with the RBA set to pull the trigger on the first rate rise in 11 years.
A third of Australians are renters, but finding affordable accommodation is becoming a crisis for many. Rental stress is increasingly the norm, with rents at a 7-year high and vacancies at a record low. For the past few years, investors have been selling their properties to owner-occupiers, while others have turned them into short-stay accommodation. Here's Daniel Ziffer.
Veronica Silva is being turfed out of her home. Her landlord is selling it.
It's just too hard. I'm crying myself to sleep most nights because it's just stresses.
She's found somewhere else to rent, but it's 60 kilometres further inland, away from her 13 great-grandchildren.
I'll end up locking myself in that house and not coming out. That's what's going to happen to me.
Her new place costs $70 more a week, so Veronica will have to cut back on food and her internet. Across Australia, rents are rocketing.
We have a national level crisis around housing supply.
Every year we say it's tight. This year it could not be tighter.
Vacancies are at record lows.
We've seen a lot of investors leaving the market, and then when the pandemic hit, that selling by investors really was supercharged.
REA Group estimates around 20% of current properties are sold by landlords, while only 8% are bought by new investors. Despite our growing population, the number of houses and units available to